First test screening we had, which was in quite a big theatre, with a very diverse group of people, all ages and genders and all sorts of things, and in a particularly difficult scene, a fight broke out between two audience members. One person did not like what was happening, and the other person was saying, if you don't like it, you don't have to stay. And then they were arguing. But it happened over the course of this scene, so it was quite nervous after. It's not what you necessarily want from your first test screening.
What scene was it?
It was the scene when Kira gets smothered to death.
Yes.
Yes.
That'll do it.
In 2020, just 3 years after the mainstream Hollywoodification of the Me Too movement took off, and premiering initially a couple months before the pandemic started, a film by writer and actress Emerald Fennell titled Promising Young Woman was released into the world. Being the director's film feature debut, it, along with Fennell and lead actress Carey Mulligan, received widespread critical acclaim for what was being referred to as an audaciously feminist movie. This audaciously feminist movie was both comedic just as much as it was dramatic and garnered comparisons to Jordan Peele's directorial debut, Get Out.
Good. First of all, I want to thank you for making one of the best films I've seen in a long, long time. If I see another film as good as this in 2021, I will be very, very happy. So first of all, I just wanted to say that. Second of all, while I was watching it, a movie that came to mind was Get Out. You know the scene where Bradley Whitford is saying, I would have voted for Obama a third time if I could have, not really comprehending the internalized racism.
Yes.
Watching this, I thought he did a fantastic job of creating the kind of fake woke guys, the ones who truly believe they're the nice guys.
Yes.
And then a fear washed over me. I was like, are you ready for these guys now to say Promising Young Woman is their favorite movie as a cat-up line?
Oh.
The film's hyper-feminine look was displayed across the promotional photos and social media clips. One picture showed our protagonist, Cassie Thomas, played by Mulligan, sitting in a Jesus pose in a classic pink lips and teeth logo, as the lipstick drips down the cover. Take her home and take your chances, a tagline read in another promo written in pink with the same pink lips logo as the one before. The marketing was trying to draw us in with what appeared to be a thriller about a dangerous woman doing something stealthy and sinister and possibly utilizing her hyperfemininity to do it. Emerald Fennell worked with Michael Perry, a production manager who also did work on the 1990s teen show Sweet Valley High, and the 2015 horror film It Follows. In a 2021 article from Deadline, Fennell said, quote,
I saw It Follows. Its beauty and cleverness and visual wit just blew me away. Considering that movie was on an even tighter budget than ours was, it looked completely unique in a complete female way. Fennell tells Deadline.
Fennell isn't totally wrong. In the actual film itself, we are slapped in the face with hyperfeminine aesthetics. The minute we cut to the glittery hot pink and purple opening credits. Throughout the movie, Cassie dons a colorful manicure along with bright colored dresses and t-shirts and sweaters. One of the shirts we see her wearing is a red and white baseball t-shirt with a rainbow in the middle, a small child with a gun slung around their back, and a dying deer resembling Bambi embedded on the front. Emerald Fennell and her sister Coco Fennell, one of the designers for the shirt, said it was meant to represent the character of Cassie.
My sister, Coco Fennell, who was a designer, designed the t-shirt that Cassie is wearing with a bit of artwork by an artist called Seal Warnants, which looks very sweet, a little bit like the movie. It's a rainbow and a boy apparently hugging a Bambi, when in fact the boy has a gun slung around his back, which you can slightly see there, and the Bambi that he's hugging is nursing a wound.
The upbeat pop music, mostly by female artists, and some of which are throwbacks to some early 2000s classics, is what encompasses most of the soundtrack, and is meant to work in contrast to the movie's underlying dark tones, starting with a remix of Charlie XCX's 2017 song Boys, and ending with Juice Newton's 1981 cover of Angel of the Morning. This was part of what made the film seem daring. It was unapologetically feminine while also tackling one of the biggest and longest-lasting plagues on our society: hookup culture. At least according to Emerald Fennell.
And again, this is a great example of a kind of different type of situation, a situation where again, somebody thinks he's just playing within the boundaries of the rules we've seen before. And again, you know, Chris is just an amazing comic performer and someone that we've all like admired and, you know, watched even as a kid, like, you know, in movies. And so again, it's sort of that feeling watching the movie of like your friends almost, which makes it doubly unnerving when you see them, you know, doing something they really shouldn't be doing.
Promising Young Woman centers around a 30-year-old woman named Cassie Thomas who spends every week at a nightclub pretending to be drunk in order to bait aspirational sexual assaulters to try and take advantage of her. When they inevitably try and almost succeed, Cassie reveals to their surprise that she is in fact completely sober. These men, who appear and sometimes even explicitly identify as nice guys, are so shocked and frightened that their interest completely dissipates. Cassie marks these encounters down in a tiny notebook that she bookmarks with a scrunchie. She lists their names and makes tally marks in red and blue ink. No one in Cassie's life is aware of her weekly activities, though Cassie doesn't have a ton of people in her life aside from her parents who would really like her to move out and or do something more with her life aside from working in a coffee shop, or her manager/friend Gail, who also wonders why Cassie has settled for this life rather than go back to college and continue to pursue her dreams of being a doctor. Cassie's old classmate Ryan, whom she reunites with one day while at work, is also confused since she was a really excellent student. It wasn't just her though. There's a girl named Nina who was referred to vaguely throughout the first 30 or so minutes of the movie. After one of her late night drunken charades, we see Cassie say goodnight to Nina while looking at a childhood photo of the two of them. And on Cassie's birthday, which she forgets about, her mom mentions that Cassie started working at the coffee shop after she and Nina both dropped out of med school. It isn't until Ryan brings up some old classmates that bring unwanted memories for Cassie that we finally get to the actual plot of the movie. She tries to act coy when he name drops a girl named Madison McPhee, who has just had twins, and later Al Monroe. Al Monroe, who has just moved back to America from London, is getting married to a bikini model named Anastasia, and now works as an anesthesiologist. This sends Cassie down a social media rabbit hole when she looks up her old classmates whom she hasn't spoken to in years. The movie then splits into chapters, each one marked by bold pink Roman numerals, similar to the tally marks in Cassie's notebook. In the first mark, Cassie invites Madison out for lunch. Before she arrives, she pours a glass of champagne for her, and then pours a glass of ginger ale for herself and hides the can before Madison makes her way to the table. The two drink and laugh and reminisce and catch up on what they've been up to since college. Cassie congratulates a now intoxicated Madison on her accomplishments and proceeds to take the conversation in a less fun direction. She asks Madison about an incident in college where Nina presumably came to her about an assault that happened the night before, and whether or not her response now would be different. Madison doesn't seem to have changed very much when it comes to this issue. She makes some classic victim-blaming statements like pointing to Nina's drunken partying and supposed promiscuity as the reason her assault should not have been surprising nor something anyone should have empathy for. When Madison is too drunk to think straight and knocks over the glass of wine, Cassie leaves telling her it's been great seeing her, and scornfully comments that she hasn't changed at all. We watch Cassie walk over to the bar and hand a nice but ominous-looking man an envelope and a hotel room key. She directs him to take her to room 25. After ignoring Madison's back-to-back calls and voicemails the next day, Cassie sets off on part 2 of her revenge mission. This time she's going after her old college dean, Dean Walker. Before she gets to her, she goes after Dean Walker's teenage daughter, Amber, who was getting out of school when Cassie accosts her by pretending to be a makeup artist for a nameless boy band that Amber just so happens to be a huge fan of. She pretends as though she's asking for directions to a diner, and the girl, upon learning about her fake profession, gleefully hands over her phone and enters her vehicle in order to help her out. We fast forward to Cassie now dressed in a blazer at her old college for a meeting with Dean Walker under the guise of wanting to resume her studies. As with her lunch date with Madison, she tries to jog the dean's memory of her friend Nina, which the dean struggles to do. However, the dean has no trouble remembering her assaulter, Al Monroe, who the dean calls a really nice guy. But when Cassie informs her that about 10 years ago, Al took a drunk Nina to a hotel room and repeatedly assaulted her as she was too drunk to consent and his friends stood by watching and laughing, Dean Walker begins to realize what this meeting was about all along. Cassie tells her that Nina reported this assault to her, and the dean apologizes for not remembering her, but tries to reassure Cassie that she did everything she could before zeroing in on the fact that Nina was drinking, and that we never want to admit when we've made regrettable choices. This, of course, disappoints and upsets Cassie, who then drops a bomb on Dean Walker by telling her that she picked her daughter up from school and, quote, introduced her to the boys who live in that room now, and pulls out her daughter's cell phone as proof that she is not fucking around. Cassie remains unfazed when the dean screams at her and demands she tell her where her daughter is. Defeated, the dean sits down and admits that she is right, and once again begs her to tell her where her daughter is. Cassie smacks her gum a few times before laughing and telling the dean that she would never do something like that, and that her idiot but gorgeous daughter is sitting in a diner waiting for her favorite boy band to show up.
It's the Castle Diner if you want to call and check. Or you should probably call, actually, or she may never figure out they're not coming. She's kind of an idiot, huh? Gorgeous, though. Who needs brains? They never did a girl any good.
Cassie leaves and goes on another one of her fake drunken adventures that comes to an abrupt end when Ryan, who she just canceled a date with earlier, runs into her with a guy at a club, the guy being Jerry's friend and coworker from the beginning. The next day, we get our third tally mark when Cassie shows up on the front doorstep of a defense lawyer on a sabbatical named Jordan Green. She tells him today is his day of reckoning, and he responds, "I've been waiting," before inviting her in. Cassie gets straight to the point and asks him if he remembers Al Monroe, one of the many men he worked with who had similar cases. She is shocked to see that he does remember Nina, but only her first name. From here, he begins to speak erratically about all the unethical shit he did to win his cases and destroy his clients' alleged victims in the process, from finding drunk photos to talking to old sexual partners. Jordan, now on his knees, lightly clutching Cassie's hands, expresses to her how disgusted he is with himself over that and that a psychotic episode and an epiphany has interfered with his ability to sleep at night, apparently for years. He begs her to help him, and through tears, Cassie tells him that she forgives him. And when she leaves, we see her telling what appears to be a hitman she hired that the hit is off. After visiting Nina's mother, who implores Cassie to move on, Cassie takes her advice. She trashes her notebook and deletes her social media account. And just as Cassie is prepared for a new beginning, Ryan shows up to her job to give her a second chance. Things finally seem to be on the up and up after Ryan meets Cassie's parents for dinner, and afterward her dad takes a moment to tell Cassie how much he and her mom have missed her. This seems to really hit Cassie emotionally, but nothing will hit her harder than what Madison presents her with in the next scene. Madison shows up to Cassie's house to ask what happened with that man, and Cassie tells her that he didn't do anything but keep an eye on her and apologizes for not calling her back. Madison then tells Cassie about a tape of the assault that got sent around at the time, and decides to give it to her. Cassie, hesitant, watches the video through tears, and her heart sinks when she hears Ryan's voice. Confronting him with it at work, Ryan immediately resorts to self-pity upon hearing his voice in the video. But Cassie doesn't even seem to have the energy to engage with it, because all she wants to know is where Al Monroe is having his bachelor party. She blackmails him if he doesn't help her, and so he does. In our fourth tally mark, Cassie, dressed as a sexy nurse with a candy-colored wig, shows up to Al's cabin deep in the woods as a rendition of Toxic by Britney Spears plays during the scene. They invite her in, and she plies them with what we will learn later is alcohol laced with drugs that knock them all out except Al. After Cassie strips for them, she and Al go upstairs where she handcuffs him to the bed and makes him uneasy when she tells him her name is Nina Fisher. He says she can't be Nina Fisher because Nina Fisher is dead and freaks out when he suddenly realizes that she was her friend. Cassie then does what she does best and gives Al a lecture, this time about what Nina was like before that fateful encounter. Cassie deeply admired Nina, who was weirdly smart and funny and was fully formed from the day she was born. But after the assault, she was no longer herself, and Al's name became a part of her in a way that completely destroyed her mentally. Things take a turn when Cassie plans to brand him with Nina's name, but Al gets loose from one of his handcuffs and smothers Cassie with a pillow. The next morning, his friend Joe discovers her dead, and Al, crying and upset, tells Joe it was an accident. Joe promises him that everything will be okay and that none of this was his fault. We later see them burning her body before we cut to her parents speaking to the police about Cassie's whereabouts. After they speak to Ryan, who lies when asked if he knows where Cassie is, we see Al get married as planned, but things come to a head when Ryan receives a scheduled text from Cassie telling him that this wasn't over. Jordan Green, the defense lawyer from earlier, receives a letter in the mail from Cassie, detailing her plans to go to Al's bachelor party along with the tape she got from Madison. A search team discovers her burned corpse as police arrive at the wedding to arrest Al. Cassie tells Ryan that it is over now, and to enjoy the wedding, before signing off with her and Nina's name. The end. So as many of you who have seen this movie may know, the ending was a little controversial. But it was actually supposed to end in a much bleaker way than what we eventually ended up getting. According to Emerald Fennell, that ending caused a fight to break out at a test screening of the movie.
The first test screening we had, which was in quite a big theater with a very diverse group of people, in a particularly difficult scene, a fight broke out between two audience members. I couldn't hear what was happening. All I knew was two people were shouting in the middle part of the movie theater. Somebody was shouting, and then somebody else started shouting. One person did not like what was happening, and then the other person was saying, "If you don't like it, you don't have to stay." They both stood up, and somebody left. I was quite nervous after.
I can't say I'm surprised, and you could say that this is just because Americans famously don't really fuck with downer endings like that. Cassie's death scene alone is jarring and disturbing to watch. The scene lasts over 2 minutes long, and it's a long shot that closes in as she gets closer and closer to death. Fennell said she spoke with her father-in-law, a retired cop, about how long it would take to smother someone, and he said about 2.5 minutes.
And so we timed it out. He said about 2.5 minutes, and so that shot is one shot, and it's 2.5 minutes, and it is unrelenting. It's completely unrelenting. But I really believe strongly that if you're going to show violence, you need to. I think actually the worst thing you can do is treat it glibly. So it is shocking, but it's not supposed to be nice. But luckily everything's okay. But when it was happening, when we were watching it, it was just silent. Everyone was just standing at the monitor. All of the crew, everyone was just, it was horrific. It was just horrific to watch.
As soon as Al's hand gets free and he attempts to smother her, we don't see Cassie's face ever again. We only hear her squealing through the pillow. It's uncomfortable. It's very abrupt. And up until we get to them burning her body, you almost can't believe it's real. But Fennell was not trying to fool us. Cassie is dead. And the scene where we see Al and his friend Joe burning her body in the field was the original ending to the film. But of course, financiers for the movie felt it was too bleak, and so the more cathartic ending was added. At the time, there seemed to be two camps of people. Those who loved the ending and those who absolutely hated it. Those who loved it praised it for its realism and usually cited Fennell's defense and explanation for the ending.
Question one about the ending is that from what we gather, the ending that ended up on screen is not the original ending in like the first versions of the script.
Yes and no. In my mind, when I was writing it, the ending was going to be the big fuck you cathartic ending. It was never written because the moment Cassie is in that room, I realized that there is no way of honestly showing that because it's not true. If what we're doing with this movie is saying like, this is what we think, this is a revenge movie with a woman at the center, and she's going to put on a sexy outfit and she's going to kill a ton of guys, and that's going to make us all feel more comfortable and better. Weirdly, killing lots of people is going to make us feel better. But what I really wanted to do, and again, that's why one of many reasons why talking about the ending is so difficult, is that there is no violence in this movie until I put a weapon in her hand. There is violence, and it is against her, because I cannot imagine being in a room with a man threatening him where it plays out in any different way, no matter how much we want it to be the case. And also from Al Monroe's point of view, again, what I said to Chris, you're a good guy. You're a fucking lovely guy. You love your fiance. Something happened at university that you barely remember with a girl that was, as far as you guys were all concerned, like crazy drunk and always shagged everyone and, and she dropped out and whatever. Like, I was sort of saying to him, like, this woman is going to do something terrible to you. You're going to fight for your life. And it's going to be horrific for both of you. Like, it just, and so in the draft in my head had a sort of a neater ending, which the moment it was on paper disappeared. But the first draft that I handed in, the first full draft that I handed in, didn't have the final bit. It didn't have part 5. It ended in the mountains with the fire.
The ending wasn't the only main twist of the movie, though. The first big twist of the film is when we see what Cassie actually does with these men that she pretends to be drunk for. Again, based on the marketing, we were led to believe that this was going to be a bloody rape revenge film. After the cold open with Jerry, where Cassie scares him to death when she asks him what he's doing, we don't see what happens. We just see Cassie walking down the street with ketchup dripping down her clothes the next morning, trying to fool us into thinking it was blood. The movie knows what it wants you to think is happening, but it's not what's happening at all, and Emerald Fennell seemed very proud of herself for subverting people's expectations on this front. The minute Cassie stops the drunken charade, she gives the men the equivalent of a timeout. a talking to, which seemed to operate more as a potential catalyst for the men's self-reflection. And one scene that I didn't go over during the plot breakdown is the first scene where we see this in action. While at the apartment of a man named Neil who rubs coke on her gums, tries to finger Cassie before seeing that she's sober, and almost immediately becomes fearful of her presence. Cassie then asks him why it's bad that she's sober and why he was so determined for her to stay before. Neil says he thought they had a connection, and Cassie gives him a pop quiz on her hobbies and interests. When he fails to even recall her name, he says he gets the point, and then asks if she thinks he's a predator. He says he's a nice guy, but Cassie wants him to know that he isn't as rare of a gem as he thinks he is, and that every week she goes to a club where she pretends to be shit-faced, and a nice guy like him comes over to see if she's okay. Then she leaves, says to be careful next time he goes out to the club, and insults the premise of his novel on her way out the door. The movie being subversive was what colored most people's praise of the film, and at the time I would have mirrored those exact sentiments.
And again, that's not even a criticism. I think that is like an incredibly cool, all things considered, filmmaking choice. But it was like, I was expecting like revenge movie where she wins.
I was also expecting that.
One of those.
So.
I actually, okay, liked is a tough word in that scenario, but I think what I appreciated about that ending, and I think this is something I also appreciated more when I heard the director talk about it, is that it made, because it is just, it's so sad. It feels the most realistic just from my own perspective, that it's like, yeah, sure, I would love to, I don't know, I guess have revenge in these situations, but I just don't do that because out of safety, And then I think that like, sometimes when the revenge does happen, that makes me almost feel worse because I'm like, well, God, I guess I should just do that, But no, if it almost kind of like presented another way, I guess also speaking from a survivor's perspective myself, I guess it does feel like, the relationship that I have with that is like, well, I guess, I don't know, maybe I could have done more to prevent this, right? And so then I think that kind of is like, okay, or
that could end very badly.
We don't have a lot of choices, we don't have a lot of like options here. So I kind of appreciated it for that, even though totally brutal what actually went down in the scene, right? Just like, whoa, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I totally hear you. And it's one of those endings where, and the movie parallel I'm coming up with, I really hope that someone could think of a better one, but just a movie in which like there is this quest that like an oppressed character is on, and at the end they lose. It doesn't necessarily mean that is like not it may not mean it's an empowering story, but it doesn't mean it's not an important or impactful story. And unfortunately, what I'm thinking of is Rosemary's Baby, and that's not great. But that if you think about like Rosemary's quest to overcome this, she's met with only obstacles, and at the end she fails in that quest, and it's like she is crushed under the pressure that she's been pushing against. And that I feel like it's like a similar thing that happens to Cassie. She does everything she possibly could do, and it's too much. Like it's too much for one person.
So I used to really like this movie. The first time I saw it was around the time it came out, and I too was taken aback by how well it did subvert my expectations. I went into it completely green, not even knowing it was about sexual assault, and was pleasantly surprised. At the time, it did feel as bold as critics who praised it said it was. In an article for Variety, which interviewed Emerald Fennell and Carey Mulligan, the title dubbed the film the most audaciously feminist movie of the year. Coming off the heels of the Me Too movement, you can see how a movie where the female protagonist makes people reflect on their actions in regards to sexual violence would resonate with people. The title of the movie, of course, being a play on The Promising Young Man.
I mean, because what would you have me do? Ruin a young man's life every time we get an accusation like this?
So you're happy to take the boy's word for it?
I have to give him the benefit of the doubt.
Emerald, I've seen this theorized. I don't know if it's true, if you've confirmed it, so I wanted to ask you about it. But in terms of the title, which really pops out, was that a riff off of the Brock Turner case, this college student who was convicted of sexual assault and intent to rape, yet was often referred to as a promising young man?
It's really difficult because I don't think that it was, but certainly, that as a phrase is so commonly used when young men do something wrong. They are almost always referred to as a promising young man, whether it's a case like this of assault, whether it's even, if they get a gun and do something completely reprehensible, there's always this kind of like this inclination to be forgiving. And I believe entirely in forgiveness, but it's an interesting thing when you look at promising young women. If you look at the phrase promising young woman, it's hardly ever used. And if it is used, it's usually to describe a girl who's no longer alive. So it's an interesting thing that you can only really be a promising young woman when it's too late, when your promise is kind of completely aborted. So I don't know, but really it seemed at the time to be just the perfect encapsulation of who Cassie is.
It seemed to center the traumatic aftermath of an assault and how those close to people who have been assaulted are sometimes left completely destroyed as the destroyers are living happily and getting married to bikini models. Cassie is angry because Nina and her trauma has been forgotten and now hasn't. In a 2020 review for the film for The Hollywood Reporter by Todd McCarthy, he criticized some of Fennell's hacky storytelling and unsubtle exposition before still giving the film flowers for its boldness.
From its modest beginnings as a story about a young woman who gets trashed most nights, Promising Young Woman ventures boldly and very far in suggesting the extent to which sexual abuse took place and was, and is, then neatly swept out of sight, not to be mentioned again.
One of the most acclaimed aspects was the fact that it seemed to call out everyone, not just men. And so Cassie's revenge against Madison the Dean, and by extension the Dean's teenage daughter Amber, appeared to address internalized misogyny and how women play a role in perpetuating rape culture and coddling men who they value more than what they see as just a drunk slut who partied too much. Returning to Todd McCarthy's review, he says later,
Fennell's film could be called polemic, but dramatically it's so sharply and boldly laid out that its narrative shocks rule the day. It's jolting to witness how it refuses to let anyone off the hook. Bro, where? Tell me where. You're joking.
I think one of the most interesting through lines in many critics' positive reviews of this film is how much the authors compare Fennell's movie to older rape revenge films in ways that seem condemnatory. Promising Young Woman was seen as a new kind of rape revenge, particularly because the protagonist does not win in the end like most rape revenge films. Lacey Bogger spoke to this in a film review for Den of Geeks, saying,
Cinema is full of stories of righteously angry women who have suffered at the hands of wicked men. Invariably, these stories also see those women reclaim power over their own narratives by brutally punishing the men responsible. In Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill, the bride stands triumphant, holding a katana over the mangled bodies of those who tried to do her harm. Jennifer Sheik makes the boys of Jennifer's body pay for their misogynist behavior with their own blood, literally feasting on their souls. Revenge socialite Jen reinvents herself as a gory action hero as she literally hunts down the men who violated her. There are power poses and triumphant musical chords, all acknowledging that justice has in fact been served, and that bad men have been disciplined, that a heroine has claimed her power and set the world to rights again. Usually, there's also no small amount of death and blood along the way. See also all three movies mentioned above. Initially, it seems as though this is precisely the sort of film that Emerald Fennell's Promising Young Woman intends to be. Its marketing strategy leans into the idea that Cassie Thomas is a sort of avenging angel in a provocative dress, a candy-colored vision who tempts terrible men to their own well-deserved destruction, all set to the sound of a banging orchestral cover of Britney Spears' Toxic in the trailer. But then, too often, that's what audiences want. An easy solution to a complicated problem, wrapped in some brightly packaged Hollywoodized reassurance that there are, in fact, some sort of consequences for those who do harm to women. But this isn't that film, and Promising Young Woman doesn't particularly care if that fact makes viewers uncomfortable. Instead, this is a movie that pushes us to directly confront the harsh, deeply uncomfortable reality of such a situation, rather than revel in the entertaining but empty catharsis of a blood-soaked fantasy romp. And that's precisely what makes Promising Young Woman so incredible and so difficult to watch. This is a feminist revenge movie that lives in the world as we know it today. Here, there is no final reckoning, no bloody triumph, no movie poster-ready stance from a woman who can finally put down the emotional burden she's been carrying and find the justice she's been seeking. There's no real sense that anything that Cassie's done has made much of a difference at all, and though she does eventually manage to punish her best friend's rapist, this one single clear victory comes at the cost of her own life. Throughout its runtime, Promising Young Woman revels in bringing a particularly harsh and ugly truth to light. There's only so much female rage can do in a world that's not only set up to constantly make women fail, but which fails them so utterly in turn.
About 5 to 6 years ago, I would have agreed with all of these takes. But 2020, believe it or not, It was quite a bit ago, and thankfully I've grown leaps and bounds since then. I'm still very much a hot mess, but I'm at least a smarter, hotter mess, for the most part. And my understanding of patriarchy and rape culture has evolved so much over the years that rewatching this movie in 2026 really helped me see the light. I suppose all the recent news about Emerald Fennell being yet another disappointing white, supposedly feminist woman director also contributed to this new perspective. But as my friend Marty said, this is one of those movies where the smarter you are, the less impressed you are by the film's intentions. The ending of Promising Young Woman might be subversive. Cassie lecturing the men rather than killing them or castrating them might be subversive. But something being subversive does not make it better by default. And I think Promising Young Woman got way too much acclaim for its subversiveness. The comparisons that were being made by fans and critics alike, that it was a feminist version of Get Out, is deeply insulting to Jordan Peele, who is a far superior screenwriter and whose film, while flawed in some of its politics, is much more audacious in how it gets its message across. I don't think the film, even in 2020, was ever really that bold or audacious as it clearly seems to think it is. In fact, the film is quite bad. If we ignore the politics or its handling of the topic of rape culture, it is truly a terribly constructed story. Most of the characters are severely underdeveloped, our main protagonist acts as more of a symbol than a person, and the character Nina is written so vaguely that she is ostensibly erased from the narrative. If we include the politics, the film isn't saying anything that interesting or radical. For some reason in 2020, we really thought it was. So like Jenny Nicholson, I have created a Cassie-style numbered list of everything that is demonstrably wrong with this movie. First on the list of problems is Cassie Thomas, our flawed but pretty protagonist, and her alleged intelligence. Earlier I talked about the girly bubblegum pop aesthetic of the movie and how it was meant to contrast with the dark undertones. In the director's commentary for the film, because yes, I am one of those losers who listens to those, Fennell talks at length about Cassie's appearance and how she dresses according to the occasion. In the beginning, Jerry and his friends, along with all the other men at the club, appear to have just gotten out of work. Many of them are still wearing their suits, and then we see Cassie wearing what looks like office attire. She's wearing a black blazer, a white button-up shirt underneath, with a black skirt and her hair in a bun. When she goes out with Neil, she wears her hair half up, half down, with these colorful strings in her hair and a long cheetah print skirt. This gives her a more hippie look. She also has on heavier makeup, typically when she goes out with these men. One of the scenes is of her putting on lipstick while watching a blowjob lips makeup tutorial of a YouTuber played by Emerald Fennell in a director cameo. When she goes out with Madison, her hair is straight and sleek, and she's dressed a little more conservatively. This is a part of Cassie's alleged brilliance, according to Fennell. Fennell thinks Cassie is an incredibly cunning and brilliant person, and most people who like the movie agree with this assessment. I don't. I personally think her whole sexy nurse look is very ugly, and I highly doubt even a bunch of drunk men would invite her in when they did not hire her. I think they would have seen that wig and immediately slammed the door.
Jumpin' Jehoshaphat! What the heck is that?
But they don't, because Emerald Fennell adjusts the world around Cassie in order for her plans to seem brilliant. Cassie doesn't have backup plans, and I guess she doesn't need them because everything always falls exactly into place for her. In reality, Cassie is not brilliant. She's not even really that smart. Everyone else is just dumb. And it's easy to make a character seem really smart when everyone else acts dumb. It's kind of like how for decades, true crime media would speak about serial killers as if they were so cunning and intelligent because they were able to evade the police for so long, but then you actually look into these cases and you realize that the police were, as they are now and have always been, just stupid and incompetent at their jobs. Many were just bigoted and didn't care enough to do their jobs effectively when it came to certain victims. This is what our tax dollars go to, everyone. These serial killers were not exceptionally brilliant anyway. Most, if not all of them, were extremely sloppy with their murders. When it comes to Cassie's revenge tactics, they are also sloppily planned and don't ultimately matter in the long run. Let's start with Madison, because, oh boy, do I have some shit to say about her.
That's the same question, how to praise your character. I think Madison kind of represents the female contingent that is part of the societal cover-up of bad behavior by men. And, she certainly learns her lesson over the course of the movie, but I think it's important to recognize it's not only men who can be a part of victim blaming and pointing fingers at what people deem a certain type of woman, and Madison is that type of woman. And then, she learns a little bit, to be slightly, I think this movie's about having awareness for that sort of thing.
As much as people lauded this movie for not letting anyone off the hook, the Madison character has probably done the dirtiest out of everyone. Madison is meant to represent women's internalized misogyny. Fennell says she wanted people to see Madison and possibly relate to her flippant disregard of the incident as something some women have had to evolve from as they've gotten older. Madison's unchanging attitude on the situation is written to make us despise her, so that when Cassie abandons her while she is extremely drunk with some man she hired from who knows where, we're meant to be worried for her, but we're also meant to feel like she's getting what she deserves on some level. Emerald doesn't necessarily brush aside the seriousness or the fucked upness of what Cassie does here, but Cassie as a character is so hollow sometimes that it's hard to know how exactly Cassie feels about what she did. We do not know this man that Cassie leaves Madison with. Perhaps if we did, perhaps if he was a close friend, I would interpret this scene a little differently. But we don't know him, and while that is part of the mystery, it is a thriller, the movie doesn't actually seem to fully understand the gravity of it. Because when Madison shows up to her house later and asks her what happened, Cassie tells her that nothing happened, that he just kept an eye on her. But how does she know that? Was she there? Because as far as we know, Cassie leaves her with him at the restaurant. Maybe we're supposed to think because this is someone Cassie hired and because we see later that she is willing to forgive those she's confronting, that this is a safe man, but I don't personally feel that way. He very much could have still assaulted her and Cassie would have no reason to know that because she fucking left. So Madison being like, phew, after Cassie says nothing happened is so ridiculous. It is the logic of a child. Because what reason does Madison have to trust anything that comes out of Cassie's mouth at this point? She invited her to this restaurant under false pretenses, plies her with alcohol, leaves her there with some man she doesn't know and also has no reason to trust regardless of what Cassie says, and then ignores her phone calls for who knows how long because there is no clear timeline in this movie. There's no reason why the waiters at this restaurant would just continue to serve what is very obviously a woman drunk out of her mind. There's no reason for Madison, a grown adult who possibly drove there, to just drink excessively during the day as if she's a teenager with no self-control. Maybe if Madison had like a drinking problem, this would be a little more believable, although definitely more evil on the part of Cassie. The fact that we're supposed to believe that Madison, who was blackout drunk, somehow remembered even half of that conversation and that did a complete 180 in how she viewed what happened to Nina is just not probable to me. When it comes to her drunken nightclub pranks, she's also not very meticulous when it comes to that either. Why would she go out with the friend of one of the men she pulled this on? And why wouldn't she at least go out of town or something? Again, this is 2020. Word about her absolutely would have gotten around enough for people to avoid her. And not to be super graphic, but did Cassie ever consider these men have roommates? Sometimes when predatory men see drunk women they can take advantage of, they like to include their friends. I don't imagine the whole lecture thing would play out the same way with a bunch of men planning a gang rape. Another example of Cassie's shoddy planning is when she kidnaps the dean's daughter. So let's break down this scene, shall we?
Ready? Okay.
We don't see how Cassie gets this information about the dean's daughter, though it's possible she just Googled her and found her social media and then found her daughter, I guess. But it would have been nice to see that. It could have added some, say, realism to how she goes about this. Emerald Fennell said in the director's commentary that when she wrote this scene, she thought about how easy it would be to get a teenage girl into her car. Now she would probably pretend as though she were working with One Direction in order to do so.
I've been thinking a lot. I've been thinking of women as predators and about how easy it would be for me to get a teenage girl into my car versus any of my male friends. And so I just wanted to show really Cassie's cleverness at using, again, same as, the scene before, just her cleverness at using the way that she looks to maintain this idea of innocence and to get people to do what she wants. And, so for me, I thought, well, if I wanted to get a teenage girl into my car, I'd imply that I was, lost and looking for my workplace, which happened to be where One Direction or the similar band were. And, what I love about this moment is she not only willingly gets in the car, she gives her phone away. And it's really only when the door locks that she notices what's happening.
Wow, such an audaciously feminist movie, you guys. She thinks teenage girls are stupid. I don't deny that young people can be naive and walk into situations without thinking them through, but nothing about this scene makes any logical sense. Even in terms of movie logic, it is so absurd. If the movie was campier and wasn't so far up its ass about how realistic it is, maybe I would be a little less annoyed by it. But Fennell, and I hate to say this, but you asked for it, frankly. You asked for this CinemaSins ass breakdown that I'm about to give for this plot point. Because this entire plan hinges on Amber not having a functional brain. So what happens is this. Cassie sits in her car outside the school waiting for Amber as she is getting out of school. It is broad daylight and there are many people in the vicinity. Okay. She's also not even trying to disguise her identity. She pretends to ask for directions to some diner and offhandedly mentions that she's a makeup artist, and the minute she says music video and boy band, this completely takes over Amber's brain. When she sees a makeup palette in her car by some brand name Wet Dreams, this convinces her that she is legit. Somehow. She gets all giddy again like a typical teenage girl. We don't even get a fake boy band name, she just says boy band, and she hands over her phone and then gets in her car? For what? For why? Why would you do that? Just to give directions? Do you guys do that? Do you get into people's cars because they ask you for directions somewhere? Is that a thing? If she was like 12, this would be a little more believable. But she is in high school, and nowadays in this post-stranger danger society we live in, I do not believe even a 12-year-old would have fallen for this. And that's not to victim blame any young person who has been led into an adult's car under false pretenses. I'm not saying it's impossible, I just don't think it would happen this way. But the fact that Emerald finds this to be a smart plan really speaks to how she views teenage girls, and how sadly a lot of people do. I've complained about this with Greta Gerwig as well. A lot of feminist directors who write movies that center women have a strong tendency to only cater their feminism toward older women who look like them. I've seen women who seem pretty staunch in their feminist politics who have some of the most reductive opinions on teenage girls and young women in general. I don't know if Emerald has daughters or not, but thinking a teenage girl would hand a stranger her phone because she said music video and boy band in the same sentence is so unbelievably sexist. But because so many fucking people hate teenage girls, we just let this shit slide. Hardly anyone who praised this movie criticized this, and I find that a little baffling, even if I shouldn't, since I notice this incredibly mean and cruel depiction of teenage girls and people's complete disinterest in interrogating it at all the time. I get that this is such a normalized trope that it goes over a lot of people's heads, but this is misogyny, and it's also just mean. If Cassie's plan felt more thought out, this could have been less offensive to me. How is having a makeup palette on your passenger car seat enough to convince someone that you work for that company? If Cassie, say, made a fake Instagram profile making it look like she worked for Wet Dreams, something more than just you relying solely on her being an idiot, and as she rudely says about her later. I suppose it would be difficult to amass a large following within that short span of time, but still, she needed something else to make herself seem like she actually worked for these people. There is no explanation for what exactly happened between her picking her up from school and her meeting the dean right after, which would mean office hours were about to close up, so I don't even find this plausible, but maybe that's a little too CinemaSins of me. What exactly did Cassie tell Amber before she left? And what teenager in 2020 is letting anyone leave their location with their cell phone? I'm 28 and I can't even imagine being somewhere in public without my phone. You can't defend everything by saying that it's just a movie and it's movie logic. I can drive with movie logic. I am a horror movie fan. You kind of have to if you're going to enjoy that genre. I also love camp. I am able to suspend my disbelief when the writing is more cogent. Going back to my point about how it was broad daylight, there's also no reason for Amber's mom not to have contacted authorities after Cassie left, and even though I'm ACAB all day every day, she should have. Cassie does all this shit and doesn't really deal with any kind of consequences for it, which is yet another example of Cassie clearly being a wish-fulfilling self-insert of Emerald Fennell. After the scene with the dean, we cut to Cassie in her car, parked at a streetlight with her head on the steering wheel. A frustrated dude behind her pulls up beside her, and instead of just flipping her off, calling her a bitch and calling it a day, he decides to also stop and sit at a streetlight and proceed to berate her because that's totally what someone would do in real life. And then he sees her pull out a tire iron, and instead of, pressing on the gas and going on his merry way, he just sits there as she smashes his car. No one is around but one other car for some reason, and no one calls the police or anything. Wish fulfillment. Again, this wouldn't be a problem with any other rape revenge film, but this movie is claiming to subvert that. It's claiming to not be about catharsis, but at scenes like this, a scene clearly meant to be cathartic for women who get to watch a sexist man get his car smashed in. But with Emerald Fennell, it seems like this realism shit only applies to her shitty ending, which brings us to problem number 2.
of a movie, but I do think, if you're making, it's a visual medium, obviously. And it helps enormously, I think, if you can make these sort of visual, they're jokes, but they're also steers and they're also symbolic. And I think that's what Cassie is. She's just an avenging angel. And I think, the concept of angels really is quite frightening. All of it's quite frightening because being judged is frightening. And so, I think that's why Cassie is so frightening. I kind of said to everyone, all of the actors in this, you think you're good people and someone's going to come and find you, someone that you barely even remember from your past, and they're going to show you that you're not. And so how are you going to react?
Emerald said in numerous interviews that one of the underlying themes in the movie is asking viewers what they would do if someone showed up on their doorstep and told them that they weren't as good of a person as they once thought they were. Due to the way Cassie handles the men during her drunk pranks, it seems Emerald Fennell thinks that people can change on a dime due to one person telling them something. I don't think my spirit would break if someone I knew from high school showed up at my door and told me I was a bad person. I think I would just tell them to get the fuck out of my house. Some people said they enjoyed how Cassie used psychology rather than violence. But it's not like Cassie is doing some master psychological tricks on these people. She's just fucking with them. She's asking them questions and asking them to reflect, but that's not how you change people, and it would never happen that swiftly. What are we supposed to take away from Cassie's drunken pranks? Are we seriously being led to believe that these men also did some serious reflecting after she leaves them? Because if she doesn't feel that way, what is the purpose of her throwing her life away to do this every week? That's why this subversion is mostly disappointing. It doesn't actually lead to anything. When Cassie goes out with Jerry's friend and he suddenly remembers her, he mentions Jerry, who referred to her as crazy. It doesn't seem like Jerry learned all that much from whatever amazing speech she gave him. So what exactly did Jerry even tell them? Hey guys, I went out with that hot drunk blonde, and when we got to my place, I realized she wasn't even drunk, and then she lectured me and just left like a crazy person. That is not how humans work, and for a movie that got so much celebration for its realism, that seems like it's written by someone living in Fantasyland. Another major part of this movie that felt subversive to people were the men Fennell cast as the aspirational seductors, as she would probably call them. Instead of the typical tough, handsome jock archetype, the movie aimed to criticize self-proclaimed nice guys and cast lovable comedic actors to play them. This is one of those things where I'm like, okay, that's something, but it's also nothing, as a lot of things in this movie. I think the problem is that Emerald Fennell doesn't actually understand what it is that she's writing about. In that Variety article, Emerald says the film isn't just for people who are very well versed in this stuff, and that this is a topic she cares very deeply about, and I'm sorry, I don't believe her. I believe that she believes that, but anyone who has a thorough understanding of this topic would also struggle to believe her. As my friend Ofidoki pointed out when we watched this together and in her video about this, the word rape isn't even uttered in this film, and that was not unintentional.
For Emerald, I wanted to know, was it a conscious decision to not use the word rape? Because I didn't hear it throughout the movie, or unless I'm wrong.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious to know why that didn't come up in the film.
Yeah, well, I never wanted to show it. I think often in movies like this, we see the incident and we expect that. I don't want to say it, I don't think any of us do, I think we know. And I think men like Al don't ever say that word, ever. Even if it's to deny it. And that was important to me. Because we had takes where he did say it, but I didn't believe it. It's the reluctance to even be in the same room as the R word, I think. Yeah.
So this is one of the first examples of the ways Emerald Fennell constantly contradicts herself when she talks about this movie across various interviews. In one breath, she'll say that she couldn't see the ending of Promising Young Woman going in any other direction because women just don't resort to violence, and a man would absolutely overpower her. But then it's like, okay, well then why was Cassie about to carve Nina's name into his abdomen? That sounds like, and Correct me if I'm wrong, but gee, that sure does sound like a woman resorting to violence if you ask me. She'll say Al killing Cassie felt more honest, but she admits to being afraid of the word rape so much that she deliberately omitted the word from a script for a movie about rape, as if that in and of itself isn't dishonest. So much of her defense for that drawing ending is that it's more realistic, and that is what people celebrated about it, but nothing else in this movie is realistic. Cassie's backup plan going into action the day after she's discovered missing, the cops even searching for her at all when she's like 30 years old and she really was only gone for like a day. Even the men inviting her into their cabin makes no sense. But this half-baked ass script is just that, a half-baked script. Emerald Fennell admitted with her whole mouth that she didn't even write a second draft for this movie. This script won a fucking Oscar, mind you. That is white mediocrity at its fucking finest. Emerald seems to think so highly of herself that she doesn't even think she needs to do a second draft. She thinks so highly of herself that she didn't even do any research on rape culture or even college rape culture, which this film specifically touches on. Maybe if she did, she would have realized how immature it is to refuse to say the word that you're making a film about and even go so far as to refer to it as the R word like she's 12. That is embarrassing. Wouldn't it have made more sense if everyone else aside from Cassie were refusing to say the word and it was Cassie who consistently hammered home that what happened to Nina was rape? Like, I just don't understand what Cassie's motivations are exactly or what it is she's trying to do. Does she care about other vulnerable women at these clubs she attends? Because the fact that she nor anyone else ever says it, and Cassie even describes what happened to Nina as Al repeatedly having sex with her, doesn't really line up with Cassie being offended by the dean calling it regrettable sex. That seems to be how the film views that situation since it's so afraid to say the actual word. If I'm to offer any grace to Emerald, I would say that this is an issue with us as a society collectively. The word rape can get your YouTube video flagged. People avoid saying the word, either because they find it triggering or they feel others will be triggered by it. I don't think there's anything wrong with using different words interchangeably. I try to switch it up, but I do think it's important to still say the word and not just talk in euphemisms. For a film that is claiming to hold a mirror up to society, it's not challenging anyone or anything that much by completely avoiding the word. If Emerald Fennell hadn't stood 10 toes down on that decision, at least then I could possibly give her a small pass and assume that was partially a studio note or something, but she stands by that shit, and I think that's fucking baffling. And it's even weirder to me how many people who like this movie defend every single explanation Emerald Fennell gives for these choices and make her film seem smarter than it actually is. In a mean but extremely correct article from Mancunion, Maisie Nichols said, quote,
"And I hate to give the French anything, but the original rape revenge film served a purpose that Fennell somehow swerved, depicting vigilante justice as an outlet for aggression necessitated by a misogynistic justice system. Fennell gleefully exploits the rogue revenge fun with none of the subtext, with Cassie's death sequence constituting the only actual on-screen violence, a solid 2 minutes and 50 seconds of femicide. And fine, if the goal was to avoid the Hollywood ending and smack the audience in the face with realism, then great, make that choice. But why then pull the punch? Why enact justice in the film's final moments, implying that the most noble thing that women can do is die? Fennell undermines her own criticisms of the police's response to violence against women, leaving cops that ignored the original rape allegation to enact Cassie's epic Twitter-owned justice from beyond the grave. The writer/director fittingly punctuates her living contradiction of a film with a hard period that borderline says back the blue. In fact, why pull every punch? We're led to believe that Cassie kills the multiple bar loiterers that try to rape her when in actuality she lectures them. Now, says Fennell, we need not castrate the rapists. If you sternly tell them to stop, then you too can solve rape and go add another tally to your stupid little notebook.
Fucking love how mean this article is. In the director's commentary and countless other interviews from that time, Emerald spoke about an element to Cassie's character that was decidedly cut out of the film, which showed bruises on Cassie's arm, indicating that some of her encounters did not always end well. I don't really get why she brings this up so much when she cut it out. She brings it up as if it's a part of the story when it isn't. You cut it out of the story. So we're meant to believe that every week that she does this stupid shit, they all end the same way it did with the McLovin guy. I think it's hilarious that we all just decided to give Emerald Fennell a pat on the back for this, when it's also misogynistic and infantilizing of men. Putting women in the role of a therapist and talking down to a grown man like he's 5 years old and just didn't know that it was wrong to take advantage of a drunk girl is again the logic of a child. Emerald presumes the reason men prey on drunk girls is because they think it's normal and fine when no, that's not why men do that. But Fennell is operating on this logic that all it takes is one person to tell you you're bad and suddenly
I can see clearly now, the rain is is gone.
If Emerald feels that men always resort to violence and women don't, then why do these men act like they are scared out of their minds when Cassie stops pretending to be drunk? Or does she think that men only become violent if they feel a woman is about to become violent with them? It seems that she views Al murdering Cassie as him impulsively reacting to being attacked when, again, no. Smothering someone for 2.5 minutes straight is not an impulsive act. This kind of thinking is very bioessentialist. One of the things that Emerald contradicts herself over is when she is asked about whether or not Cassie was going on a suicide mission. She insists that she wasn't, but always makes sure to add that Cassie is just so smart that there's no way she planned to go to a cabin in the middle of the woods alone with a bunch of drunk men and didn't think anything bad would happen. So she prepared for it. That sounds like a suicide mission to me. And it's funny because people defend this by stating that Cassie was on a suicide mission, because they point to her using fuzzy pink handcuffs, which are famously very easy to get out of, as proof of that. And yeah, why have her use those if this wasn't a suicide mission? Seems like her plan was to die. The whole thing about Cassie having a bruise that was cut out is also brought up when she answers this question, as if this thing she cut out is what foreshadows her final plan with Al. But if Cassie was a real person and not just some weirdly religious symbol and also a self-insert, we could have actually seen that so that the ending of the movie wasn't so jarring. Because as Macy said, it's the only time we see actual violence in this movie. Comedy dramas make up a huge portion of some of my favorite movies, but I don't think this movie does a good job of balancing those two genres. A more fitting example would, I guess, be the vibe of a Tyler Perry movie. Most of his movies have the main plot centered around a really serious and deep issue like child sex abuse or domestic violence. And then the B plot is just Medea. As much as I despise those movies, I get why at least the older ones were appealing to people, but the comedy/drama in Tyler Perry movies is usually so poorly mixed together that it's mostly campy, and Promising Young Woman doesn't even manage to be a little bit camp, which would have fixed this issue if only slightly. It's odd to shoot a long drawn out scene of a woman being smothered to death as we hear her squeals and cries for help, and then as soon as that's over, the film just becomes a full-on comedy to the point that we're not even really meant to take Al, who is distraught and sobbing, seriously.
But the thing I couldn't help noticing on my second and subsequent rewatches of this movie was another element to how these would totally definitely stop men are portrayed. This repeated theme of a really weird and overblown sort of humiliation they go through. We don't see every man do this. In fact, we don't see how Adam Brody reacts to his lecture at all. It's not just Sam Richardson's character running away crying, living with his parents, and getting portrayed as a total loser. Once you notice it, it becomes hard to unsee how often we see men crying in this movie, which I'm typically totally down for. It just doesn't work here. It's not done in a way that makes me feel satisfied or as though Cassie has inflicted any real revenge on these men, but in this way where it sort of makes me feel like Fennell believes the most she could degrade a man would be by subjecting them to tearful humiliation. We also see another form of this with the lawyer asking for Cassie's forgiveness and being granted it, because he went through the worst trial a man will ever face in an Emerald Fennell movie. He had to cry, and in front of a woman. It's very weird. Weirder when we don't see any of the women cry. Weirdest that I believe this sight of various men crying, Paul, the lawyer, Al Monroe weeping in bed and being comforted by Schmidt from New Girl after he's committed femicide against an ostensible sex worker, feels like it's meant to be understood as on par with the psychological torture we saw Cassie put the various women in this movie through.
It's not a good balance, and that doesn't feel realistic to me. I don't know if I believe someone, even people as shitty as Joe, would react so flippantly to seeing a dead body in that bed. Also, wouldn't he have smelled something when he came in? Anyway, fans say the reason the ending works and is in fact more cathartic than your traditional I spit on your graves is because Cassie had to sacrifice herself in order for Al to be brought to justice in some way. And that humiliation was the ultimate revenge, even though practically there's no way for Cassie to have known if any of this would have played out how she wanted it to. Cassie had scheduled texts. What is realistic about that? And what is realistic about her having them scheduled specifically on his wedding day? As if she knew exactly when all this evidence would have been brought to the police just in time for him to be humiliated at his wedding. How does she know Jordan will give the tape to the police? And how does she know anything will come of that? For someone so obsessed with realism, she doesn't seem to understand how the real world actually works. The fact that Emerald wanted to end this movie with her body being burned tells me that Emerald simply wanted adulation for something that was shocking. It's like Family Guy in the early 2000s, where the comedy was seen as genius because it was shockingly offensive. Not because the jokes were creative or clever or funny or new or innovative. They were just shocking, and people sometimes receive so much undue praise just for doing something shocking, even when it is such a thorough misunderstanding of a genre. But if you haven't seen Don't Breathe, spoilers I guess, but the twist in Don't Breathe is so absurd that it's just stupid and literally ruined the movie for me. It's mostly just for shock value. I'm blaming this on 2010's Disney animated films for starting this trend of doing shocking twists without any complex thought put into them. If this movie isn't meant to be cathartic, fine. Then don't market it as a rape revenge movie, and don't fool us into thinking during your cold open that we're getting a more interesting movie. It's kind of mean to market it that way so heavily and have this be what it actually is. It's anticlimactic, frankly. If this movie is supposed to be so realistic, why is Nina the only rape victim in this entire movie? Going back to Madison, Cassie's plan to make Madison think she was assaulted is predicated on the assumption that Madison has never experienced sexual assault, even though she also has no way of knowing that. Just because she slut-shamed and victim-blamed your friend doesn't mean she hasn't experienced rape. So Cassie could have also possibly re-traumatized someone and put someone's life in danger because she was mean about her dead friend. Cassie and her mom have no connection, which I get is mostly intentional. Cassie has become disconnected from pretty much everyone in her life, but I think it would have added something to have her relationship with her mom develop in some way. Maybe the mom opens up about her own experiences with assault, or they have a talk about Nina. Her friend Gail, played by Laverne Cox, barely has any kind of connection to her. It mostly exists as a sassy black friend to help the pretty white woman with all of her problems. You could literally cut Gail out of the film and it wouldn't change anything about the story. I'm happy she's there because I like Laverne Cox, but you could have, gave her a personality. We could have had a scene where Gail gets to talk about herself and her life and not just Cassie and her boring life problems. Most women have sadly experienced rape or some form of sexual violence, and it just feels like such an oversight to basically pen Nina as the only rape victim in the entire story, but also not even really treat her like a real person either. Even Cassie's description of her at the end with Al feels like when you're sending an email and Gmail will autocorrect your words and it will even give you full sentences to use if you can't come up with any. It's like she was writing Nina and just clicked the default options of what a sympathetic rape victim would be like and went with that. Like, oh, she was fully formed from day one. Like, really? She was fully formed with the whole personality upon coming out of her mom's vagina? Give me a fucking break, Emerald. She was so smart and funny, like how adults are funny. This just sounds like Emerald doing self-insert bullshit again. This is how Emerald probably feels about herself. I think if Nina wasn't featured so vaguely in this film and we at least got to see what she looked like as an adult, she would have felt like a real person. Because the first time I saw this, I thought the big twist was going to be that Cassie was Nina. And I really think that's what the twist should have been. Because that speech she gives Al could have felt less trite. A woman who experienced sexual assault and has become so disconnected from her past self before the assault that she speaks about her as though she's an entirely different person. It's so obvious once you do any reading on this movie that Emerald rushed the script. The movie was reportedly fast-tracked by Margot Robbie's production company Lucky Tap to be made within 9 months. The movie was capitalizing off the Me Too trend, and it affected a lot of people emotionally because while the Me Too movement was important and certainly expanded many people's understanding of rape culture, the mainstream Hollywood version of it did not really lead to any actual systemic change. It did in some ways reignite purity culture and cause people to develop swarthy Andrea Dworkin-like mindsets around sex. People's understanding of consent remained unnuanced, and people still don't understand rape culture. And I doubt anyone came out of this movie with a better understanding of it. One of the most glaring aspects to me as a black woman is how much Cassie's white womanist doesn't even factor into any of Emerald's explanations for her film choices. Earlier, when I talked about the scene with Amber, I brought up Fennell saying she imagined what a female predator would be like. And in other interviews and press junkets, like this one for the Oscars, she says,
"This scene, it was partly because I'd been thinking how easy it is to be a female predator. You know, a young woman is an innocuous presence and only needs a certain amount of forethought and planning to seem credible enough to convince a girl to get into your car."
Young women seem innocuous. Yeah, her being young is the only reason. Definitely, miss. My 14-year-old brain thought of Heathcliff as Jacob Elordi. I don't think Cassie is intelligent because she's able to disguise herself and manipulate her way into places. I think her being a pretty white woman is what contributed to people not seeing her as a threat. How many people is Jordan inviting into his home because they had some shit to say to him? To me, if you're trying to subvert the rape revenge genre and lean more into realism, you should tackle the things past rape revenge films failed to. And one of those is race. Conventionally attractive privileged white women are almost always centered in media about rape victims and even just in general discussions around sexual assault. There is a reason it took 2 decades for people to give a shit about R. Kelly's victims. The film has no self-awareness of how much her white privilege factors into why she never faces any consequences for her sloppy-ass plans. And speaking of her conventional attractiveness, Cassie is dressed to the nines in every scene. Emerald obviously sees this as Cassie's genius at work. I get that her look is supposed to match the aesthetic of the film. She looks pretty on the outside, but what's going on inside is 10 times uglier. But it would have been more compelling and it would have given Cassie some depth if the only time she is dressed like that and heavily made up is when she goes out hunting for rapists to lecture. If Cassie going out of her way to put so much work into her appearance in every single scene is supposed to represent Cassie trying to mask her deep sadness, you could have made that clearer. Show a scene of her taking her makeup off and crying, or something. Something that tells me this woman has a heart that beats. Because there are really only 2 moments where I feel that way. It is when she watches the tape, and the part after the dinner scene when her dad tells her that they've missed her. And she just kind of stares at him before he walks away, and you can tell this really hit her in her gut. Cassie is supposed to be dead inside, I get that. I am also dead inside, but that doesn't mean I'm not still a sensitive crybaby. Carey Mulligan and Emerald Fennell have said Promising a Woman is not just about revenge, but about forgiveness. Carey specifically harps on the fact that Cassie has never been able to forgive herself, something that's only broached in the scene between her and Nina's mom, played by Molly Shannon. They're reminiscing about Nina when Cassie tries telling her that she's sorry she didn't go with her. This is the only time this is mentioned, and so for me, it wasn't delved into enough for it to be impactful plot-wise. Emerald talks about Cassie as someone who can't let go of what happened in the past, and now there's something scary about someone who refuses to let go. Knowing that this was how Emerald saw this story, it put a lot of things into perspective. Promising a Woman isn't just bad because of its embarrassingly juvenile handling of such a serious and complex topic. It's also bad because it is yet another frustrating forgiveness movie and a film full of religious references. This issue isn't unique to Emerald, obviously, but the concept of forgiveness is another major theme in the film that isn't subverted in any way. Emerald seems to think it is, and fans point to the Jordan Green defense lawyer scene as one of the prime examples of that subversion. But I am not surprised by anything that happens in that scene, because forgiveness narratives in the media are always predictable, always dismissive of the concept of trauma, and always, if it involves a woman, very sexist and misogynistic.
That there are lots of things, there are lots of parts of it that it is a sort of a kind of Greek, almost kind of touching on Greek tragedies or the kind of biblical stories, which are, Cassie as the avenging angel who comes and offers redemption or punishment. And that is just all the film is about. It's about redemption and punishment and what you choose. And it's ultimately, for me, a film about forgiveness. But that people only get forgiveness if they admit wrongdoing. So many people, and this is across the board about all sorts of things. People want forgiveness. They don't want to be, they don't want to feel like they've been wronged, but they also don't want to address it. They don't want to apologize. They don't want to admit. And so for me, all that Cassie is doing, and she's called Cassandra as a kind of nod to the sort of original Cassandra. All she's doing is saying no. And I think this is one of those scenes that I find and found most gratifying. Just from a plot point of view, I think this thing of what Cassie's doing. I mean, it's interesting. This is a revenge movie, of course it is, or at least it's a sort of maybe subversion of one, I hope, too. But really, I think this movie is a movie about forgiveness. And so Cassie here, and in all of her scenes, when she makes her visits, she's offering forgiveness or punishment. And but people only get forgiveness if they admit to what they've done or they understand what she's saying. And it's amazing, none of them do. And, it's just one of these moments where you don't know how far Cassie's going to go.
In the 2018 Rockstar video game Red Dead Redemption 2, we start off playing with a character named Arthur Morgan. a lonely wanderer as he describes himself, who never settled down and lived his life based on a code of loyalty to his father figure Dutch Vanderland, a charming and manipulative, self-absorbed asshole who does sometimes seem to care about his found family. We meet the Vanderland gang on the run from a bank robbery gone awry, and you spend most of the game moving from place to place as the law continues closing in on them until everyone is forced to break up and choose sides. The character of Arthur differed from John Marston from the first game, which takes place after the events of RDR2. I've never played the first one all the way through, so I can't speak too much to John Marston in that game, but what my nephew has told me, Arthur is more of an anti-hero than John is. Or he's at least not as interested in being nice and friendly. He's what we would call unlikable if he was a female character. Arthur struggles with self-hatred because deep down he is somewhat angry with himself for not just settling down with Mary, a woman he dated when he was much younger and was very much in love with. Arthur had a son from a one-night stand with a waitress, but wasn't fully committed to being a full-time dad and would only visit him when he could and would help them financially, until one day he discovered that they'd both been killed by a burglar. So Arthur spends most of his life as an outlaw, following orders from a man whom he's come to believe will always have a plan. Red Dead Redemption 2, as beautiful as it is, as much as I enjoy replaying the storyline over and over and over again, is deeply flawed for so many reasons. And I think RDR2 fans accept way too much of the story at face value to see that it is not a perfect game because nothing is perfect. Something I didn't pick up on until replaying it recently was the weird anti-revenge narrative surrounding so much of the plot. Revenge is a fool's game is a line Arthur got from his father, and he repeats it a few times throughout the game to various characters. RDR2 has some very strong religious overtones. Many of the missions are named after biblical terms and passages and shit. This informs the way the game chooses to portray morality. It's very black and white. For context, the game has this thing called an honor system, which acts as a choose your own adventure, sort of. Not totally, more like choose your own ending, I guess. Like the game is an old-timey version of GTA, which means you can kill and shoot and rob and run people over with your horse if you want, but unlike GTA, where you'll either escape the police till the stars blink away, or you'll be killed and respawn at the hospital, or you'll be arrested and let out the next day with a clean record, your honor will go down. There are longer-lasting consequences to your actions than just losing your money or your weapons. How you treat people and whether or not you help those in need during random events when you're just free roaming the game will impact some of the dialogue in different missions and will alter the way Arthur's story ends, whether or not he will get redemption. But it's very wonky, I think. Sometimes the game will take away honor if you kill someone who's trying to kill you. It's such a black and white 1 + 1 = 2 type of system that it doesn't always understand when you're just defending yourself. One of the most pivotal missions is in the first half of the game when Arthur, going to collect debt for the gang, beats up a poor sick dying man who coughs in Arthur's face. Something that doesn't cross your mind the first time you play until you get to chapter 6.
What is it? It's not good news. I guess that. You got tuberculosis. Really sorry for you, son. It's a hell of a thing. What do you mean? You're real sick. It's a progressive disease. And you'll be... Well, the best thing is rest. And getting somewhere warm and dry and taking it easy now.
Even though Arthur is kind of a terrible person, you still become deeply attached to him as a character and you want the best for him. And reaching this part of the game for the first time, especially not knowing beforehand, is gut-wrenching. And it is this that forces Arthur to begin to really see the error of his ways. He finally sees that Dutch is full of shit and maybe was never the man he thought he was, as he becomes more and more manic and unhinged. If you go the good boy route, there's an option to visit a monk in the city of Saint Denis, which is meant to be like New Orleans, I'm pretty sure. Beautifully designed town, but wow, is it so fucking annoying riding your horse around there. Anyway, you meet this monk, and if you help him out, you'll eventually meet this nun named Sister Calderon, though he mainly calls her sister. This leads you to running into the wife of the sick dying man Arthur beat up named Edith Downs, who now, since the death of her husband, is a sex worker. Towards the end of the game, after Arthur learns he is dying of TB, sees that Edith and her son Archie have moved to this really rundown coal mining town called Annisburg, where Edith continues working as a sex worker and Archie works miserably in a coal mine and gets bullied by his coworkers who know his mom is a whore, as they call her. So Arthur, feeling guilty, gives Edith and Archie money to get out of Annisburg and move somewhere else to make a better life for themselves. The reason why even talking about this and giving this context is the last mission that Arthur has with the Downs family. Arthur finds Edith and apologizes to her, and while he does advise her not to let her resentment and pride consume her, and she does give him advice on how he could redeem himself, she does not completely forgive him. She accepts his help, but she tells him that he can go fuck himself for all she cares, and I love that. The honor system and the way Arthur's redemption is written is messy and not great for the most part, in my opinion. It's not until his last chapter that Arthur begins to see why taking debts off of these desperate people was always wrong. But for some reason, if you choose to absolve their debts and give them money, the debtors will thank him and call him a good man. It happens so many times that it's almost a joke. The game thinks doing something kind of decent after doing something terrible instantly puts you in the good guy category. Arthur rejects these compliments because he hates himself, but that doesn't stop these people from treating him like he's exceptional for doing one good thing. And that's why I appreciate that they don't make Edith do this for him. What makes it so much better is that Arthur is okay with that. He doesn't hinge her forgiving him on whether he will help them to make up for what he did. And he doesn't demand or beg or plead for her to forgive him. He just wants her to let him help her and her son. Is he doing this partially to make himself feel better? Yes. But at least we don't get a scene of Arthur on his knees, grabbing Edith and essentially begging her to forgive him. What I'm saying is, Red Dead Redemption 2, a game made by a bunch of men with heavy religious overtones, really should not have a more radical forgiveness narrative than Promising a Woman, a movie that was being described as audaciously feminist. Or frankly, most forgiveness movies for being real, especially when this narrative involves a woman, and women being forgiving is typically written as a virtuous trait that makes a woman good. Speaking of forgiving women, Elena Gilbert from The Vampire Diaries. We always come back to TVD somehow, don't we? Elena Gilbert is a very controversial character in the TVD fandom. A lot of people hate her and a lot of people love her. Those who love her, from what I've seen, typically point to her forgiving nature as part of why they think she's a great character. As I've discussed in the past in various TVD videos I've made, I find this alarming. You can like Elena, but I deeply resent this idea of being forgiving as an intrinsically virtuous thing that should be celebrated in a person. Because Elena being forgiving does not benefit anyone but herself and her toxic codependency on Damon. She forgives the actions of a man who has sexually assaulted her childhood best friend and never even bothered to apologize, because that's how little he gives a fuck about the best friend of the woman he claims he loves so much. She forgives the actions of a man who murdered her brother in front of her after forcing himself on her. She forgives the actions of a man who pretends to be better for her when they finally start dating in season 5, only to find out that he was secretly murdering innocent people behind her back because their ancestors imprisoned him about 60 years before. She forgives all of these things, and the writers of the show, along with fans, viewed this as a sign of how deep her love for Damon was, and not a sign of an enabler in a codependent relationship with an awful person. I don't think being forgiving of someone, no matter what they do, because you see the good in them, makes you a good person. And listen, I don't abide by this idea that you're either a good witch or a bad witch, but this idea permeates throughout RDR2 as well. You can live your life being awful, but if you do a couple nice things every once in a while in between all the horrible stuff, that means you're worth endless forgiveness, even if you've proven that you are incapable of fully redeeming yourself, because your redemption depends on whether or not a forgiving woman has energy for you. And the minute she doesn't, or needs a break, or just simply wants to move on with her life, you will go back to your old ways, and this won't be seen as a red flag to the forgiving woman, because to not forgive would make her a bad woman. Women are both primed to be forgiving of men, and their constant betrayal, while also being stereotyped as being unequipped to forgive and let things go.
Alcohol to the mix, and the fact that women don't let things go. They're like the Olympic athletes of grudges.
No, I love my grudges. I tend to them like little pets.
People view women as being petty grudge holders. And I do think this, coupled with our society's disdain for people who struggle to let things go, is what furthers this pressure on women, and people widely really, to be forgiving. We pretend like we have a better understanding of mental illness, and we profess to have more empathy for people struggling with their mental health. And yet when it comes to trauma, people still manage to completely dismiss it as a concept. There are people who still believe in this idea that time heals all wounds, which is possibly real for some things, but not for all. People feel like if enough time has passed, it's weird to still be upset about something regardless of what that something is. A lot of this stems from Christianity, as fucking everything in our deranged society does. There's an annoying scene in season 2 of Euphoria where Rue hits rock bottom with her drug addiction and afterwards tries to try and get her life back together. It begins going to church. In her voiceover, there's a moment where she says, "Say what you want about Christians, but at least they believe in forgiveness."
My mom is one of those rare people. But maybe that's because she's my mom. She also grew up in the church. And say what you want about Christians. At least they believe in forgiveness.
As if the general consensus in our society is that forgiveness is bad. It annoyed me so much. Who doesn't believe in forgiveness, Sam? And why did you write that like it was some kind of mic drop? Forgiveness is good? What? I've never heard that before. It's not like the idea that forgiveness is viewed as the ultimate way for people to heal isn't shoved down our fucking throats from the time we are children or anything. Like, what are you talking about? If what Rue meant was that people are unforgiving towards people who struggle with substance abuse, that line is a horrible way of getting that across. Lots of people, even people who aren't religious, hold forgiveness in a very high esteem. There are therapists who push forgiveness onto their clients, even if they explicitly state that forgiveness is not something they're interested in giving or working on in their treatment. My last therapist believed so much in the gospel of forgiveness that she had it tattooed on her fucking arm. And I'm not kidding when I say that. At the time, I remember telling her that I didn't know how to forgive this person who has hurt me my entire life. The literal reason I hated myself so much growing up, and she just gave me the old, forgiveness isn't for the other person, it's for you. And I never had PTSD again. Like, this therapist got paid to just give me empty platitudes, and she really thought that was supposed to do something for my PTSD. I think if secular therapists are shoving forgiveness onto their clients without even explaining to them what that looks like, when the person isn't ready or the person they're forgiving hasn't changed or sincerely apologized and doesn't deserve forgiveness, that forgiveness is a pretty universally affirmed idea. Even if I would say that sentiment is potentially slowly evolving, thank fucking God. Or maybe not thank God, frankly. Maybe we should stop thanking him, because the idea that someone doesn't deserve forgiveness will get shut down by so many people, because the very fact that you can't means that you are fucked up and broken. In fact, you're actually worse than the person who harmed you, because you can't just forgive them and move on.
Christianity views forgiveness as the cancelling of a debt, a choice you make regardless of, and in fact often in spite of, your feelings. Every person should receive your forgiveness whether they deserve it or not. And it frames it as a kind of test of faith and character as well. Like, it makes you a worse person if you cannot forgive somebody for sinning against you. God will pass his judgment upon you. It also, wrongly, makes it into an uphill battle. There is a lot of emphasis on maintaining your forgiveness after the fact, which are framed as tests from either God himself or Satan trying to stop you from turning the other cheek. As this article on the ABCs of Christian forgiveness states, Satan will try to steal your peace. Only the indwelling Holy Spirit can provide you with the grace and strength needed to maintain a heart of forgiveness. And even though you may never completely forget the sin against you, at least you can remember that you forgave the offender. After you forgive, your attention should be on God. It should not be on the offender or the offense. I don't really think I need to point out that if you've really forgiven somebody, their sins shouldn't still be preying on your mind afterwards, because if you've truly forgiven them, then you will have moved past it. But this is how Christianity frames it, as if your conscious choice to forgive is more important than anything, including any reparations or repentance the guilty party chooses to do or not do. Which is how you end up with people who have vocally forgiven others, while internally resentment builds and builds and builds and builds inside them until they explode. I'm not speaking from experience at all, because they never actually forgave anything. They just convinced themselves they had to, because that's what good people do. This is not a good strategy for living a fulfilling life.
There's this terrible Christian movie that used to air on BET from time to time when I was growing up called Women Thou Art Loosed, starring Kimberly Elise and Loretta Devine. The story is about a black woman named Michelle who was sexually assaulted by her mother's boyfriend when she was a preteen, and her mom took the side of her boyfriend over her daughter. This led to a traumatized Michelle having a rough upbringing and eventually turning to drugs, and I believe she works as a sex worker, or she's trading sex for drugs or something. Her mom is still with the man who assaulted her, which is sadly not an uncommon thing in real life. And so Michelle isn't close with her anymore. And what she doesn't know is that her mother's boyfriend, Reggie, the rapist, has found the Lord, which means we must feel sorry for him. Michelle tries to repair her life and even considers finally going to church after being pestered by this very weird Christian lady. She goes one day during something called Revival. I'm not Christian if you can't tell, so I can't speak too deeply on what this is exactly, but people are coming to ask for forgiveness and let go of things from their past. So Michelle brings the dress that she was assaulted in, and just as she begins to place her dress on the steps, she sees Reggie, and they lock eyes. He cries and tells Michelle he's sorry, and she shoots his ass. Because duh, of course she does. Women That Aren't Loose takes place in two separate timelines. It shifts back and forth between the past and the present, and in the present, we see Michelle in a jail cell, and the whole movie we're just waiting to see the exact reason. While she's in there, she's visited by the bishop, the real T.D. Jakes, who was at the church that day. In one scene, Michelle asks him to tell her mom she's sorry, and this all happens as she builds this house made out of popsicle sticks. But it's then implied at the end that Michelle, was executed, because the camera pans over to her cell in the last shot and she's gone, leaving only the wooden house she built, which was meant to symbolize Michelle. Michelle was punished by this movie for shooting a man who raped her when she was a child. What are we doing? That is such a cruel way to end her story. What the fuck? For what? For why? I don't understand. I mean, I do, but I don't understand.
I don't understand. I don't understand. I don't understand.
Michelle's punishment is mostly based on Reggie's cries for forgiveness. See, when a man is willing to cry and beg for forgiveness, as a woman, you have to forgive him. Because only a real man will let go of his pride and get down on his knees and beg you to forgive him. And if you don't, then you're a terrible person. Fuck you. You deserve to live the rest of your life in prison and be given the death penalty. It is such a fucked up idea, and it is precisely why Talia Mark III, with a defense attorney and promising a woman, pisses me the fuck off. It is probably, aside from all the Madison stuff and Cassie dying, the worst part of the movie. It is so hacky and lazy and boring and predictable. I am not against forgiveness as a whole. I don't think forgiveness is inherently bad. I just don't also think it's inherently good. And I'm exhausted with being told over and over again by people, by professionals, and by the media that it is. Why does Michelle have to forgive this man? Why is she punished for that? I mean, I understand legally speaking, the law doesn't usually care all that much if you kill someone who abused you, but the film agrees with this. It sees Michelle's story as a tragedy because she wasn't able to forgive him because he asked for it. Because she sought revenge by killing him, which is one of my biggest criticisms with the morality of RDR2.
And don't get me wrong, I've got faults, just like the next man. But I was working on them.
I didn't understand why I should forgive a man like that. But now I do. You can never really get even. What I did was wrong. No matter what he did to me, it was wrong.
I would have appreciated Cassie's journey if it was more about her learning to forgive herself for not being there for Nina. That is, if we're going to have a forgiveness narrative at all, that is more preferable to me. Cassie's reasons for forgiving the defense attorney are just not good enough, and it is telling that I didn't see a ton of pushback on this section from critics, even though, as our boy Todd McCarthy smartly noted earlier, it's very hacky. I find Jordan's behavior in this scene disturbing. I don't feel anything about his supposed epiphany or psychotic episode to be believable or even sympathetic. I don't really give a fuck that you feel bad. That's not worse than whatever horrible shit you inflicted on other people. Also, a psychotic episode? What does that mean? Did you see a mental health professional that helped you come to the conclusion that you did dirty shit? Because I don't know if having a psychotic episode is enough to do that. Jordan tells Cassie he can't sleep, and this is when Jordan gets on his knees, invades her personal space, and is kind of aggressive towards her. She's even a little scared of him while crying when he lightly grabs her hands. He is begging her, almost demanding her to forgive him, to take pity on him. And when she forgives him, he collapses into her lap and she tells him to go to sleep, and he does. Her forgiveness instantly relieves and heals him. This is what motivates Cassie initially to put an end to this revenge mission she was on, and I just don't understand why. I find these sorts of depictions very troubling in a society where people already don't know how to even give sincere apologies to begin with. Emerald said people only receive forgiveness if they admit wrongdoing. To me, this mindset, while also not being very disruptive, only helps to maintain this idea of forgiveness as something you are entitled to once you apologize and admit that you did something wrong, when that's not the purpose of an apology. This is why people tend to be really bad at giving apologies, because they see it as something they just need to say in order for the other person to just forgive them, let it go, and move on. And it's also why when some of those people who are expected to hand over forgiveness on a platter can't bring themselves to do so, are viewed as bitter, petty, grudge-holding assholes who are unwilling to give someone a second chance. But that's not why you apologize to someone. You apologize because you feel ashamed of what you did, and you want the person who you harmed to know that you are truly remorseful. Once you do that, in no way should you immediately expect forgiveness, nor should you demand it or feel entitled to it. Forgiveness may not be for the other person, but apologies definitely are. They're not just so that you can sleep at night. And you have to be okay with the fact that they may never forgive you, because you are the one who did the bad thing. You don't get to just cause significant harm to someone and then be upset when that person never wants to see or speak to you again. And if you're truly sorry, you will understand that. Having to live with the fact that you've in some ways ruined the life of another person is not something I can relate to, but I imagine that is a heavy thing to have hovering over you if it is something you honestly regret with your whole heart. But that is not something that will be cured with forgiveness. That guilt is something you have to work through so that you can also move on and try to do better in the future. I've talked briefly about the religious imagery that surrounds Cassie.
What sets Jordan apart is that he wants to face his past misdeeds.
No use hiding from the piper. He has to be paid.
Throughout the film, we see religious imagery, like Cassie in a position that evokes Jesus' crucifixion, visually framing her as a martyr for a greater cause. Production designer Michael Perry also used imagery of angel wings and halos to underline Cassie's role as an avenging angel. In the scene where Cassie confronts Jordan, the pair is deliberately meant to evoke Michelangelo's Pietà of the Virgin Mary holding Jesus after the crucifixion. Cassie's long blue dress in this scene further likens her to Mary, and at its core, this scene embodies another religious principle, the idea that to be forgiven, you must confess and repent.
I'll never forgive myself for any of this.
I forgive you.
People, including Fennell, referred to Cassie as an avenging angel. Throughout numerous different interviews and on the director's commentary, Emerald says what Cassie wants isn't revenge but forgiveness, but that you only get that if you admit wrongdoing.
That's important to me as well. It's just that, you know, she is frightening, actually, that she might be right, that what she believes is true, but that her methods are, I mean, very, very cruel. And really it's up to the audience whether they believe that that cruelty is merited or not. And you know, I don't really have an answer for that, I don't think.
What we're meant to conceive from this is that because Madison and Dean Walker's stance on Nina's case hasn't changed within the last 7 to 10 years, Cassie, the avenging angel, was unable to offer them forgiveness and sprinkle her magical avenging angel fairy dust to heal them. Which is why their punishment is significantly worse than the man who had a much bigger hand in Nina's downfall than they did. Dean Walker and Madison were not asking for Cassie's forgiveness because they did not know that there was anything they needed to be forgiven for. Why is Cassie suddenly the arbiter in this situation, and what exactly does one expect to accomplish from reuniting with someone after not seeing or speaking to them for years? It just seems a little unfair to me. If I'm to take Jordan's bullshit-ass epiphany at face value, then the only reason he feels guilty is because he was already reflecting on his past due to his mental health deteriorating. Madison and Dean Walker have not done that work. And sure, you can say they're terrible for that reason, but if Cassie's whole plan is to offer people forgiveness, wouldn't it be more fair to give them time to reflect on the Nina thing rather than doing this weird, scared, straight approach? An approach that famously doesn't work in most situations? What is this doing for Nina? Cassie says she's trying to fix it, but by doing what? What are you trying to fix? And how is you deciding to forgive this man on Nina's behalf fixing it? Did you think Nina would approve of you getting Madison drunk so you could leave her with some strange man so she could think something terrible happened to her? This is what I mean by Cassie feeling like a soulless character. Even if she's dead inside, her love for Nina should at least influence the way she goes about things. And I just don't know if Nina would even be that concerned with Cassie spending her life trying to get people to apologize for what they did to her. Emerald most likely felt making this a film about forgiveness was such a cool subversion to the rape revenge genre, but as I was saying before, it is nothing we haven't seen before. Going back to RDR2, one particular storyline that I don't enjoy is in Chapter 6. Really the entirety of Chapter 6. I don't have a problem with dark, depressing dramas, that is mostly what I consume. I enjoy watching and reading about things that make me feel like trash, but Chapter 6 of RDR2 was such a slog to me. It's so depressing, and the writing and dialogue becomes very repetitive and tiring. There's also a very messily written plotline involving an indigenous tribe who are being mistreated and betrayed constantly by the American government, who keep violating the peace treaties they keep making them sign. Rainsfall is the chief of the Wapiti tribe who reside on a reservation. Rainsfall is a pacifist and is willing to put up with as much bullshit the U.S. Army throws at them as long as his people remain safe. He has a son named Eagleflies who feels differently and believes that it's better to die fighting than sick and weak, referring to some of the elders on the reservation who are ill with no access to health treatments because Americans are petty and racist.
Maybe you were right. Maybe the slow death is worse than the fast one. Maybe none of these men are good. Maybe a world in which they came to us is a world that we cannot endure. But endure we must. Father, you are tired. Do not die for pride, my son. We have suffered too much in this trick. The earth, the water, they have no pride. They endure, and we must endure.
At the beginning of this section, I mentioned this whole revenge is a fool's game line that Arthur repeats multiple times throughout the game. This becomes a core theme in the game, where people who seek revenge ultimately and inevitably pay in one way or another. This is again something that stems from the Christian idea of forgiveness. As we see with Michelle from Women Thou Art Loosed, seeking revenge and or succeeding in that venture is proof that you were unable to move on with your life. Therefore, you must face punitive consequences for holding on to your pride. This is what happens to Eagle Flies, which I did make a quick reference to in my Bonnie Bennett video from a couple of months ago. Eagle Flies consistently ignores his father's pleas to stop trying to go to war with the US Army, and dies as a result of it when he takes a bullet for Arthur, who then brings him home to his father, who sadly watches him die. I don't think the game is being as callously cruel to Eagle Flies as Women Thou Art Loosed is towards Michelle, but his story is sort of meant to be a cautionary tale. This is why a lot of rape revenge movies of the past are more cathartic and enjoyable to watch, even if they also are very problematic for their own reasons, because they don't always end with a woman seeking revenge, dying, or being brutally punished for rightfully wanting to see the person who harmed them suffer. Maybe their tactics seem too unrealistic and fantastical, but they want the best for their female protagonist and they want to see her win because after what she has endured, she deserves it. People say Al getting arrested in the third to last shot of the film represents how the law doesn't care about women who have been raped, only when they've been murdered. I can see that reading of it, but I don't personally feel Emerald Fennell thought that deeply about it. I don't even think she's that critical of the police. The ending, I feel, wants to have it both ways. It still wants to play up the revenge part of this fake rape revenge movie, but it wants to simultaneously be a story where a vengeful person dies and becomes a cautionary tale.
That was right here. Yeah, right here. This is where he's telling me naked girl in the middle of the street. And when I finally stood upright, he was like in front of our truck, like this, like deer in the headlights, man. Like you need to stop and help me.
On March 6, 1983, 21-year-old Cheryl Arujo walked into a bar, and when she came back out 2 hours later, she was never the same. After having dinner with a friend, Cheryl decided to stop by a bar called Big Dan's to grab some cigarettes. After socializing with a different friend who was also a waitress and some of the male patrons, and having what she would later say was just one drink, Cheryl began preparing to leave and head home to her boyfriend and 2 young daughters. But some male patrons in the bar has other plans. Being the last woman in the bar, a couple men decided to lock the front door to prevent her from leaving, and another man began tearing off Cheryl's clothes. As the defense attorney would say later of the situation, one thing led to another. The one thing being 4 men taking turns assaulting Cheryl on a pool table as multiple other men watched and neglected to intervene. One witness recalled someone shouting, "Go for it," at one point. The bartender even tried to call the police, but was apparently barred from the phone by one of the men who raped Cheryl. After 2 hours of unending agony, Cheryl was able to get free and fled from the bar, half naked and nothing but her top and 1 sock. She flagged down a truck filled with 3 college boys, who called the police and drove her to the hospital.
Well, when I opened my door, she came running around the truck. It just literally leaped on me. She leaped on me. Arms around my neck, legs around my waist, and she didn't let that position go until the police took her off. They physically had to take her off. And it got to the point where I'm trying to like get my arm up in here so I could get some air because she was really putting a stranglehold on me. And that day, I've been in the Marine. I was in the Marine Corps, the whole bit. I never saw or felt fear like that in a person in my life.
Cheryl pressed charges against 6 of the men who were there that night. 4 of the men who raped her were charged with aggravated assault, and 2 others with joint enterprise, which is when you witness a crime and fail to stop or report it. Due to the salacious details of the crime, the story attracted national news, and when the case was brought to trial, it became the first rape trial to be televised. Airing on CNN for 3 hours a day, people everywhere were captivated by this case. One man who was interviewed by the local news at the time said he began watching the trial in place of General Hospital, a show he watched religiously. Due to this unprecedented media coverage, Cheryl's name and identity was exposed to the public when her name was not censored during her testimony. Even though many people supported Cheryl, most notably women and activists from rape crisis centers and women's groups, the initial sympathetic sentiment Cheryl received from the public began to shift. People openly supported the alleged rapist. 10,000 people marched and protested on behalf of the men, and that support only increased after 4 of the men were found guilty and sentenced to 6 to 12 years in prison. In 1984, a year after the incident, due to her name and identity being exposed on live television, Cheryl dealt with intense harassment from people around the city. Things eventually got so bad that Cheryl and her family uprooted to Miami, Florida. This story would become the basis for the 1988 critically acclaimed film, The Accused.
Jody, I suspect, I could be wrong, I suspect you're going to get an Academy Award nomination for this performance.
You could be wrong. So I'm not going to think about it. If you could be wrong, then I'm definitely not going to think
Does
about it.
that jinx things?
As far as, the industry, it's a very important thing because it means a lot of money for people and it means redistribution. I could go to the list of things that it means to the industry. It's very long, a lot longer than it is to what it means to an actor.
Around the time the infamous gang rape was still receiving tons of media coverage, screenwriter Tom Topper, who was intrigued by the story like almost everyone else, got the idea to write a movie based on the whole case, and he, along with former Paramount president Don Steele, began developing the film. While Topper's vision was inspired by Araujo's story, Sherry Lansing, one of the film's producers, was inspired by the infamous story of Kitty Genovese, a woman who was raped and murdered in 1964 as 36 people watched and didn't contact the police. Or at least that's what was reported. Put a pin in that.
I was deeply moved by Kitty Genovese, this woman who was assaulted in a courtyard and 36 people watched. I thought, how could people do that? And then there was the incident in New Bedford, Mass, where a woman was raped and men stood around and cheered. I was obsessed with the culpability of the bystander and the double victimization of people who were raped. Not only was there the crime, but then they were victimized again with this idea that they deserved it. Dawn had talked to Stanley, and we decided to make a movie.
Top Gun's Kelly McGillis was brought on to play the lawyer Catherine Murphy, and Jodie Foster, who was arguably most known for her role in Taxi Driver by that point, acquired the role of Sarah Tobias, the accuser, if you will. The story was not intended to be a Cheryl Araujo biopic. There were some name changes and some details were slightly altered. Instead of 4 men, it was 3. Instead of a pool table, it was a pinball machine. Most of this was to avoid getting sued, according to Tom Topper. Sarah Tobias also doesn't have children, as Cheryl did, but does live with a shitty boyfriend who simply wants her to get over the incident. The film starts with a long shot on a bar called The Mill, as some extremely 80s danger music plays. We see a young white man run out of the bar and into a phone booth. He reports that a woman was being sexually assaulted. Soon after, a woman with blonde hair, looking disheveled and frightened, runs out into the road barefoot and is helped by some men who pick her up in their truck and drive her to the hospital, where the nurses take pictures of her cuts and bruises and swab for DNA. Sarah, angry and traumatized, wants to put the men who did this to her away forever, as she says. But her lawyer, Catherine Murphy, fears Sarah's record and her drug and alcohol use will make it a difficult case to win. There's also the fact that Sarah, according to her and her waitress friend who was also there that night, flirted with the men beforehand. It doesn't help that her colleagues refuse to take this case seriously and urge her to just make a plea deal. Sarah isn't going for that though, and is angry at Catherine for not giving her a chance to tell her story. It isn't until Catherine meets one of the bystanders who disgustingly asserts that she put on a show that Catherine decides that she not only wants to put those rapists away, she also wants to hold the men who cheered as Sarah was being attacked accountable for not even trying to help the helpless woman. Catherine learns the name of the young boy who called the police that night and convinces him to testify on Sarah's behalf. After Sarah tells her story during her testimony and is cross-examined by the defense, who blame and slut-shame her, Kenneth Joyce tells the jury what he saw that night. And it is here that we actually finally see how the entire incident actually unfolded. We see Sarah, who was smoking the devil's lettuce, flirt with one of the men who ends up forcibly kissing her and then assaulting her on top of the pinball machine, as a crowd of men watch, chant, and cheer, and 2 others get their turn before Sarah runs out of the bar screaming. After the scene, we cut back to Kenneth on the stand, and Catherine asks him if he believes Sarah instigated this assault, and he says no. Kenneth choosing to do the right thing and tell the truth seems to influence the outcome of this trial, which finds all of the men guilty, including the bystanders. This of course relieves Sarah, and even moves Catherine to tears. After she thanks Kenneth as they leave the courthouse, the movie fades to black, and we get a title card informing the audience of the frequency of rape and gang assaults in particular. Then the credits roll, the end. The movie had once received extremely low scores during some of the initial test screenings, but it eventually ended up receiving some of the highest scores in Paramount history after the film was tested against an audience of mostly women who had been survivors of rape. The movie did well at the box office too, and earned our girl Jodie her first Oscar for Best Actress. The Accused and Promising Young Woman share a lot of similarities. Both are movies where sexual assault is the main topic, both center a blonde white woman, both were commercially successful, and both earned at least one person in the movie an Academy Award. As stated in part 2, Emerald Fennell won an Oscar for Best Screenplay in 2021 for Promising Young Woman, plus Carey Mulligan, along with the movie itself, received numerous award nominations. In fact, Promising Young Woman was nominated in at least 5 different categories at the Academy. The similarities don't end there, though. Both movies focus on the way alcohol plays a role not just in sexual assault, but in whether the victim will be believed, whether the involvement of alcohol makes the victim more or less sympathetic. In Cheryl and Sarah's case, it was used against them. People around town who supported the man insisted that she'd asked for it, and that a mother with 2 children shouldn't have even been at the bar drinking in the first place. Even though Cheryl said she only had 1 drink, the defense kept wanting to prove that this was a lie, and that she was in fact drunk. In The Accused, the defense told the jury during closing statements that some witness said she was so drunk she could barely stand. It's interesting, the defense in both the film and the real story, along with the people who resided in the city where this took place, viewed the possibility of her being drunk that night as proof that she either provoked the assault or willingly engaged in group sex. It's also interesting how often the question of whether she provoked or instigated it came up in both the film and in the media covering the true story. It was the 1980s, so I know I shouldn't be surprised by this misunderstanding of how consent works, but the idea that being extremely drunk somehow nullifies the idea that you could be assaulted is kind of wild to think about now. I guess this is the part where Promising Young Woman becomes the answer to this film in some ways. Because in Promising Young Woman, Cassie wants people to see that taking advantage of someone too drunk to consent is wrong and should be an important factor for people to consider when these crimes occur. The problem is that Emerald seems to think that rapists only assault women who are drunk. Since Nina was described as a party girl and a slut, this is suggesting that there's a certain type of woman who gets raped, much like The Accused.
A lot of alcohol. Legally drunk. And grass, too. What else? What difference does that make? She was raped by 3 men.
I'm not a rape counselor. I'm a prosecutor. And I have to make a rape case.
Then go prosecute.
In The Accused, Sarah flirts and dances sensually as the men watch. Something that, as far as we know, Cheryl did not do. The movie, while being on her side, is still playing into misconceptions around rape victims, bringing these assaults on themselves by dressing provocatively and drinking and doing drugs. And that's not to imply that those kinds of stories aren't important. I do kind of like that Sarah, and even Cheryl to some extent, is what people would call an imperfect victim, due to them being working class, a young single mother in Cheryl's case, and also committing the crime of going out and having a drink, instead of being at home with her children. It just feels like the sexy dance was implemented in order to embody the classic cock tease motif, because the men who wrote this movie are operating under the idea that rapists only rape when they are tempted by a slutty, loose woman under the influence. But to give the film one point, Promising Young Woman does not show the assault, unlike The Accused. Though I don't believe the scene was meant to be erotic, Jodie is naked during this, and that is probably one of my biggest issues. The film was produced by 2 women, but was written and directed by 2 men. And so it doesn't surprise me that the woman director is the one to not make that obviously gross choice. I know not everyone finds rape scenes distressing. I'm not completely against them. I think there is a way to convey the horrific nature of sexual assault in a way that focuses on the victim's perspective and doesn't linger on upsetting shots of the man thrusting into her, like in season 1 of The Handmaid's Tale. I especially don't feel like the victim should be naked, like, ever. Even if she's naked in other parts of the movie, I just find it to be an odd choice during a rape scene. I mean, if you're going to have her be nude, at least don't do close-up shots of her chest. Seems like a low bar. Shooting the scene was also very difficult for everyone involved. One of the men who played one of the assaulters bolted to his trailer and threw up because he was so disgusted by having to do the scene, and some of the other men got really emotional. Jodie Foster said her memory of everything is hazy because she blacked out while shooting most of it. Knowing that even acting out these scenes can be devastating for people, that makes me even happier that Fennell made that choice. That doesn't mean Promising Young Woman is that much of an improvement, though. As I said, they have a lot of similarities. The scene where Cassie is killed leaves me with the same feeling I had when I watched that scene in The Accused. We are forced to watch this woman die in the true length of time it would take to suffocate someone. She is helpless against this man who overpowers her, much like Sarah. And the way he kills her feels sexualized, with him on top of her, pinning her down and suffocating her. Emerald is obviously very defensive of this choice, and said that she doesn't think violence against women should be treated glibly. It should be shown in its entirety, I guess.
And I feel very, very strongly, as I said before, like, we see women being murdered all the time in movies, and we don't give it a second thought. And it's kind of actually kind of perversely much more shocking to me than, you know, there's a reason that we're kind of like slowly moving in, pushing in on it, because, you know, if you want to look at it, look at it. That's very much my feeling. It's like, let's not pretend that this is a kind of, you know, it's a popcorn world until it isn't. And I do feel very, very strongly that, like, you can't be glib about this sort of thing, and it needed to feel real because it is real. And so I think anything else would have been a disservice, actually. Again, it's difficult to explain because, of course, you don't want it to be too troubling or traumatizing, but then on the other side of things, you don't want to make it seem less horrible than it is, I guess.
This is another area where the subversion isn't actually that subversive. I find it kind of fascinating that those of us who liked the movie at the time are fine with this, and I'm including myself in that, but would potentially balk at a gratuitous rape scene like the one in The Accused or I Spit on Your Grave. It's interesting to me how our boy Roger Ebert called I Spit on Your Grave a vile bag of garbage for how horrific and intense the rape scenes are in that movie, but he didn't seem to have the same issue when he reviewed The Accused. Of course, The Accused is a much better film on a technical level. Spit does have dog shit audio, but I wasn't like less uncomfortable during the assault in The Accused as I was when I watched Spit. So I'm confused as to why so many fans praised Emerald for this. Even if you like the film and appreciate her not showing Nina's assault, I would think that you'd at least find her explanation for why the scene is shot like that to contradict her reasoning for not showing Nina's assault. Because it's not that we just watch her die for what feels like forever, we watch them burn her body. It is just as brutal. And in between those huge moments lies a Tyler Perry film. I find Fennell's defense very reminiscent of the way male filmmakers defend graphic sexual assault scenes. The idea that we shouldn't shy away from it by cutting away and letting the audience see the horror women face every day is the same exact defense Emerald gave for Cassie's death scene. Promising Young Woman does at least one thing correctly, but it is telling how two movies, 32 years apart, that depict graphic violence against its protagonists, fumble the topic of rape and also end with the justice system saving the day, were the ones to receive Oscars. The filmmakers felt there hadn't been any movies where sexual violence was the main part of the plot. They usually focus on the victim's lawyers, they said. And they didn't want a man coming in to save the day. But the thing is, a man does come to save the day. The Accused and Promising Young Woman both feature a man who becomes the true hero of the story.
I'm gonna tell him what happened. And what happened. Come on, man, you know. A bunch of guys were cheering and yelling and stuff. You, Kurt, and Danny. Well, you raped her. Who said I raped her? I'm not in here for rape. Did you see me rape her, Ken? What do you think? You didn't, did you? Yes, I did, Bob.
Instead of giving the video she got from Madison to her parents, or at least her friend Gail, Cassie gives it to a man she hardly knows, but who does end up contacting the police. This becomes his way of making it up to Nina and righting the wrongs of the past. With Kenneth Joyce, it is his testimony that influences the guilty verdict. In her book Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Carol J. Clover analyzes this scene, saying, "The importance of his vision is established in the first shots of the film, and it is remarkable how often and at what length the film has us look at his eyes looking at something, or nothing, as in the case of two intercut shots of him staring pensively out of his fraternity house window. Shots whose only purpose can be to remind us that amid all the conflicting accounts, there is a truth, and this is where it resides." Likewise, the rendition of the rape itself, during which the camera seems as interested in watching Ken's face watching Sarah being raped as it is in watching the rape itself. But the real giveaway is the fact that the rape itself can be shown directly. The flashback can happen only when Ken takes the stand and narrates his eyewitness account. Sarah, the victim, testified to precisely the same events shortly before. But whereas her testimony remained her own version, his testimony becomes our version. The version. As with Promising a Woman, I could see people defending this as the movie reflecting the reality that people generally don't believe women, and that it sadly took a man confirming her account of the assault for justice to be served. But I see Kenneth and Jordan as both movies wanting to present examples of men who end up doing the right thing. A way to not villainize and generalize about men as sexual predators by making a man the hero of a woman's story. I do think these components contributed to the film's critical acclaim and award nominations. It's a movie that clumsily tackles a serious problem, but isn't actually that challenging or groundbreaking. Why do you think Green Book won for Best Picture? Why do you think Promising a Woman won Best Screenplay? And not Judas and the Black Messiah. At least in The Accused, it was loosely based on a true story where a rape victim did receive justice in the end. Promising a Woman's ending is pure fantasy, but unlike The Accused, its main goal was not to offer catharsis. During the press tour for The Accused, Kelly McGillis, who played Catherine, was asked by a journalist whether or not she's experienced sexual assault. Which is crazy. That is an insanely inappropriate thing to ask someone, and what sucks is that Kelly felt pressure to just share that she had been assaulted by 2 men a few years before. And after she shared this, people accused her of lying for publicity. Despite experiencing that, Kelly said she met women who had seen the movie and said that it helped them open up about their own experiences with sexual violence. After the men were convicted in the Big Dance case, articles came out covering the debate over whether these sorts of trials should be televised. Many who defended the practice said it would be helpful for victims specifically because it would increase their confidence in reporting their stories and trying to get them prosecuted. Both the movie and this defense of televised trials are meant to inspire those watching that justice could be served for them as well. And while The Accused does somewhat accurately portray what happened to Cheryl, it doesn't tell the full story. The full story, which would have been much more nuanced than the story they decided to write. I've been purposely vague on the details of the Big Dance case. I didn't acknowledge earlier that this story took place in New Bedford, Massachusetts, a city that still to this day contains a large Portuguese demographic, many of whom were immigrants. Cheryl herself, along with the assaulters, were also of Portuguese descent, and this fact is part of why this story became national news. It ended up reigniting anti-immigrant and anti-Portuguese discrimination among the public, particularly the residents of New Bedford. People called into local radio stations lambasting the Portuguese community for what was being seen as behavior inherent to them as people. Because it wasn't just the rape, it was the fact that, according to the news, multiple men, at least 15, watched and cheered. The assault itself was upsetting to hear about. The idea that a bunch of men could violate a woman in such a way, and that other men stood by and didn't try to stop it. However, it appears that was slightly exaggerated. Much like the Kitty Genevieve story, this was an exaggerated account of the situation that ended up becoming such a huge part of the coverage that it became impossible to debunk. After all, The Accused heavily leans into the initial reports that there were multiple men watching and cheering. Later, it was revealed that there were possibly only like 10 people in the bar, and that Cheryl, who had just been brutally assaulted, got the number wrong. How fucking dare she not have a picture-perfect memory of all the men who were there that night? The problem isn't that Cheryl lied or misremembered. The real problem is the way the media played this up and didn't correct the record later. The reason I don't love this is because it feels like the media needed to emphasize on this aspect in order for the crime to seem extra horrible, as if it needed that, to sensationalize it. The story was horrific on its own, but this emphasis was used to paint the Portuguese community in a bad light, as if gang rape is an act that only the Portuguese people can commit, as if this story was some kind of anomaly. Because again, like the Kitty Genevieve story, there were people that helped Cheryl. Maybe some of them didn't prevent the actual assault, but they helped get her to safety when she was extremely vulnerable and traumatized. By completely erasing this aspect of the story from the movie, the film simplifies the case and ignores the fact that the jury was possibly influenced by the negative media coverage the men were receiving that felt compelled to consistently hammer home their ethnicity and the fact that they were immigrants. As a result, the community, fed up with the biased news coverage of them, completely turned on Cheryl and began stating openly that she asked for it because they were tired of people classifying them as innately and distinctly reprehensible. Some even went so far as to say that Cheryl should also get jail time. For what? I have no idea. One person told the Standard Times, quote,
"The fact is," Santos told the Standard Times, "a decent woman would not go into any bar to buy cigarettes."
Okay.
Well, fuck you.
This to me is a much more interesting story, not because I feel bad for the assailants, nor do I think the sentiment shifting drastically on Cheryl was solely due to what they felt was disproportionate news coverage of the incident. It's frankly unsurprising when people come out in droves to support men accused of rape. What I find intriguing is the way gender and ethnicity played such a huge role in how this case was discussed. Would the jury still have convicted these men had they not been Portuguese, or if the media hadn't demonized their entire community? The movie also, of course, leaves out the tragic aftermath of Cheryl's case. Not only does it convict the bystanders, something that did not happen in real life, it also infers this verdict as not only relieving but healing for Sarah. Sarah, in her last lines of the movie, tells reporters she can't wait to get back home and play with her dog. The last shot shows reporters gathered around Sarah, signifying to us, the audience, that Sarah has not only received justice, but can now share her experience with the world, and that she'll never have problems again.
Do you remember back when we had problems?
Oh man, that was annoying.
And since the men have been found guilty, the public will embrace and support her. But that is not how things panned out for Cheryl. The movie doesn't talk about the people who protested on the men's behalf, and how that led to people sending Cheryl and her family death threats. It doesn't include the detail about the trial being televised, which contributed to Cheryl's privacy being invaded, only making her situation worse. It also doesn't talk about Cheryl's struggles with alcoholism, following the assault, and her checking herself into a rehabilitation center when she moved to Florida. Cheryl got justice, but she was never able to fully recover from what happened to her because in 1986, Cheryl sadly died in a car accident that was later ruled as a result of drunk driving. Her daughters were with her when this happened, and they thankfully survived. By the time of her death, all of the men had been released from prison. The accused wants us to think that getting legal justice is the only way one can heal from sexual violence, that it is the ultimate revenge. It also wants us to think that the justice system works. Again, this was the supposed reasoning behind televising the trial to begin with. One woman said for the Sarasota Herald Tribune that these kinds of trials are akin to reliving that violence all over again. Victims are put through the ringer during these trials and aren't always given mental health treatment or assistance afterward. The system, in my opinion, still failed Cheryl. A working class woman who didn't ask for any of this had her identity exposed during a trial about one of the worst things a person can go through. She didn't get any say when it came to cameras being in the courtroom, as she was viciously cross-examined by the defense. And she didn't even get to truly celebrate after the convictions because the world still decided to side with the men anyway. In an amazing article for the Historical Journal of Massachusetts that you should absolutely read if you want more intimate details about the way the media covered this story, author Mia Michaels said, quote, "Tragically, a desire to promote harmony and quell ethnically based discrimination in the face of outsider scrutiny, while now over-acknowledging, let alone respecting, the rape victim's acute suffering and courage." I understand why people have criticisms against the rape revenge genre. It is not perfect or unproblematic by any means. Rape revenge films of the past lean heavily on the graphic nature of both the assault and the murderous revenge that takes place after. Men were behind the making of many of these movies, and that very much shows. The assault in I Spit on Your Grave encompasses at least 75% of the movie. Not only that, but our protagonist Jennifer is a hot, thin woman who has both her titties and her hairy pussy out for 95% of the film. Like, I couldn't even clip that many scenes from it because of how much nudity there is. Even if the writing makes it clear that Jennifer in no way wants this, it still wants to eroticize an assault against a woman. It wants to make it hot and then make up for it by having the woman kill and castrate them later. This became very apparent when I watched other movies like this that came out in the 1980s. One movie called Naked Vengeance literally starts with the protagonist having sex with her husband. And when she is gang assaulted by some hillbilly stereotypes, we get a lengthy rape scene while also making sure to keep her boobs in frame for most of it. In Act of Vengeance, a group of women are assaulted by a serial rapist who hides his face behind a hockey mask and forces the women to sing jingle bells as he assaults them. In every scene where the women are assaulted, there is a considerate amount of time spent on showing us their boobs and him fondling them. We're supposed to identify with the women for the most part, but in classic horror movie fashion, we still need to watch beautiful naked women having horrific sexualized violence committed against them. This is what I mean by Emerald Fennell's whole defense of Cassie's death scene. Women being murdered in a graphic, eroticized way is not anything new. We do see violence against women in the media actually all the time. Do people treat it glibly? I suppose, but people also enjoy watching pretty women be tortured and killed. That's why when women are hunted down and killed in horror films, these scenes go on for much longer than when male characters are murdered. There's a scene in Rob Zombie's Halloween where we just watch a topless woman being chased by Michael Myers for an absurdly long time. In Scream 4, one of Emma Roberts' friends is stabbed multiple times by Ghostface to the point that her guts spill out over the bed. And one of the most graphic scenes I've ever seen in a Scream movie. Like, he stabs and attacks her for a very long time. Much longer than they did for any other woman in that movie. And I'm positive it's because we saw her in nothing but her bra before she was killed. because that's just fucking horror. You show your titties, you get extra stabbed. In the first Terrifier movie, a naked blonde woman is literally sawed in half between her pussy crack all the way down to her head. And we see all of it. I like the Terrifying movies because I like old-fashioned slashers, but I would be lying if I said it didn't bother me how common that is. This to me is why rape revenge does work for a lot of people. Slutty women in horror movies are always punished and almost never make it to the end, even in films that people still love and enjoy like the first Scream. Rose McGowan's character is the classic slutty blonde friend who wears short skirts, has had sex, and has her nipples poking out through her shirt, so she must die like John Tucker. But in Rape Revenge, men are not being murdered because of some sexist moralistic rule they broke. They're being murdered for enacting the kind of violence on women that people never want to take seriously. But that doesn't mean the genre is perfect. Going back to what Sierra Katow was saying in that Bechdel episode, I can somewhat understand now, since reading Men, Women, and Chainsaws, why the I Spit on Your Graves don't exactly make her feel better about what she went through. When analyzing Abel Ferrara's 1981 cult film Miss 45, she says, quote, "It goes without saying that the notion of women going around New York putting bullets through male chauvinists has everything to do with fantasy and little to do with reality. Just what the male spectator's stake is in that fantasy is not clear, but it must surely be the case that there is some ethical relief in the idea that if women would just toughen up and take karate or buy a gun, the issue of male-on-female violence would evaporate. It is a way of shifting responsibility from the perpetrator to the victim. If a woman fails to get tough, fails to buy a gun or take karate, she is, in an updated sense of the cliche, asking for it. Moreover, if women are as capable as men of acts of humiliating violence, men are off the guilt hook that modern feminism has put them on. At the very least, the male spectator may take some comfort, sadistic delight, in the idea that his services as protector of his wife or girlfriend are not as obligatory as an earlier era would have them be. There's also the deeply problematic trope of rape as redemption, as something that makes women tougher and sometimes even less feminine. I don't necessarily think older rape revenge films handle this issue perfectly either, but I don't think that means the genre needs to take on a more realism approach like Promising Young Woman. People critique rape revenge for being fantastical, and that Promising Young Woman reminds us that in a man's world, a woman can never truly succeed in her revenge mission against a man. But I'm pretty sure we all know that. Emerald thinks that we're all just as ignorant about rape culture as she is. And a lot of people are, to be clear, but most of us know and understand how fucked the justice system is, how unfair the world is to marginalized people. People say they don't understand why people enjoy watching a woman be just as violent as her attackers, and that these stories don't focus on the women trying to recover. Listen, I think those movies should exist. I do wish there were more interesting films about sexual assaults and the aftermath of it, and how it can destroy people's lives. People have died by suicide in response to this kind of trauma, and I don't have a problem with that story being told. But I also don't have a problem with the story wanting to offer catharsis to people who are failed time and time again by the justice system. And even when they do get justice, are still punished in the long run. To me, it's like the movie Carrie. No, I don't think it would be right for someone to murder all of their classmates who bullied them. But watching it in a horror movie, a genre known for being, murdery, is very cathartic. It doesn't mean I think that some dumb teenagers in real life deserve to be killed with Carrie's brain. One of my main issues with the genre is more the time it takes between the assault and the revenge. In Naked Vengeance, it happens so quickly that it feels like the movie exists solely because the filmmakers wanted to shoot a titillating rape scene, and that was more important than any kind of character development or story structure. Act of Vengeance, despite its problems, is an improvement in this regard. The assailant in that movie has been reported to the police several times, but when Linda, our main character, reports what he did to her, he still finds a way to try and blame her for the assault.
Out to be the criminal?
This eventually leads to her and several of his other victims teaming up, learning some self-defense, and protecting women around town from would-be rapists. I think what I appreciate is that we at least see what led them here. It's not just a quick jump from traumatic assault and then straight into revenge. It's a bunch of women fed up with the police not doing their job and taking action into their own hands. Unlike Promising Young Woman, Act of Vengeance and another 80s rape revenge film called The Ladies Club incorporate female friendship and solidarity into its narrative. Ladies Club mostly sucks because it is centered around a cop, but one who is sexually assaulted by some men who break into her home, which eventually motivates her to create an underground club of women who lure would-be rapists into a trap so that they can kidnap and castrate them. What surprised me about this movie is how much time is given to showing the women being emotional after they are assaulted. We are made to sit with what this horrible act has done to them. And not only that, but we see other women comforting the victims, because also unlike Promising Young Woman, Many of these other women have been victims of rape themselves. To me, some of the best feminist films center the importance of female friendship as a theme, like in The Stepford Wives or Set It Off. In Stepford Wives, we see women like Joanna and Bobby expressing a genuine concern for the other women's well-being, something I don't believe Cassie is capable of doing. I also hate how white women are heavily centered in these stories. A subversive film about sexual assault would have the story be focused at least on a woman of color, a disabled woman, or at least an average-looking woman who is also fat. Maybe. I can dream, I guess. Someone who the public is even less likely to believe and show how that leads them down a revenge path. Dietland is the only show I've ever seen where a fat woman was the victim of rape, and I don't think anyone remembers that show but me. Miss 45, which still stars a white woman at its center, is a disabled woman who is mute and was unable to call for help during her assault. I say all this to say that there are improvements to be made, but we don't have to throw the whole genre away. I would love to see more sexual assault stories about marital rape or assault that happens within a once loving and committed relationship. More stories about the ways people, especially women, are often coerced into sexual acts. How saying yes doesn't mean you aren't allowed to say no later, and that you can still be assaulted by someone you agreed to have sex with. The character of Ryan is such a missed opportunity to me because you can tell the movie wants us to think he's adorable. But I never did, and upon rewatch, I found him to be extremely creepy. Him showing up at her job again because she gave him a fake number as if that wasn't a hint is not cute, it's creepy. After their first date, we see them taking a late-night walk and laughing about Bo Burnham's height, before they just so happen to reach his apartment. He instantly invites her up for a drink, but can tell that she has begun to feel uneasy, and the date gets cut short. Thankfully, Cassie doesn't exactly apologize for being understandably uncomfortable with this man who just devised a sneaky plan to get her up to his apartment. But what we are meant to believe is that her reaction is more in response to her not trusting men in general. And because, as we presume, she hasn't been in an exclusive relationship in a very long time. If the writing was smart, it could have been an interesting story about how women are conditioned to ignore red flags in a man who seems nice, who seems like the kind of guy women are told that they should want, the kind of guy who is used to being rejected but will treat her better than he can. On a final note, I think what separates classic rape revenge films from Promising Young Women is that they aren't that interested in coddling its male audience, or pandering to them in any way. The women are usually the heroes of their own stories, not some man seeking redemption. Emerald tried to do this, but it clearly didn't matter because a lot of men were still bitching about the movie being too harsh on them, which should tell you how misogyny just brews so much self-centeredness in a lot of men. If they seriously think it is men who are treated the worst, like, okay, I don't remember any of the men being made to think that they may have been raped, but sure buddy, whatever you say. But this is precisely why you don't pander to men when trying to critique patriarchy. Because then you end up with movies like this. I think you're allowed to still love Promising Young Woman if it really just does something for you emotionally. But I don't think Emerald deserved even half the praise she received for it, nor has she done anything different since to live up to the feminist cred that was unfairly granted to her. I do think marginalized people should be allowed to make mediocre movies, but I also think we are all allowed to critique them just as much as we would any other director. Fans of Emerald overstate any kind of pushback Emerald gets for her movies, even when they make bank, even when they star big-name actors, even when they receive numerous prestigious awards. Somehow, Emerald continues to be treated like some underdog who people are being unfairly critical of. The thing is, her movies just aren't that good for people to be this defensive in the first place. Place your energy towards a director who at least writes more than one draft.